Before I begin, I just wanted to let y'all know that this is part B of part 5 of the Extensive Reflection Project. If you have not seen part A, definitely watch it first since I'll be directly going off of it here. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of part 5. And with that, December 2018 is wrapped up and we can finally move on to 2019, aka the best year of my entire life. While it would start a little bumpy, this year would prove to be amazing and one of the biggest highlights as a teen, so let's get to it. So we'll of course start with January. So this month, like most of the first quarter of 2019, was not the best. While nowhere near as bad as the first quarter of 2018, the first quarter of 2019 wouldn't be too good either, and January 2019 would be no exception. At least things would get so much better in March and the rest of the year would be absolutely amazing, but for now, they kinda sucked. To start, let's talk about the false meet that I mentioned earlier. So, I mentioned back in November that the last meet I swam until 2021, but not the last meet I was signed up for. My parents knew I was no longer interested in doing meet since I told them, so they did not sign me up for the upcoming meet that took place the first week of January. However, my coach, who noticed that I was not signed up for the meet, decided to sign me up for the meet anyways. I didn't even know he was allowed to do that, given my parents didn't initially sign me up, but he did anyways since he was that butthurt about me not swimming in the meet. This meet, which took place on January 5th, was a home meet, so at least it wasn't too far. But the events he signed me up for were god-awful. He signed me up for the 200 IM, 100 backstroke, 100 butterfly, and just to quote-unquote make sure I would attend, he put me in the boys medley relay and specifically made me the backstroker despite it being my worst stroke and the other boys being significantly better at it than me. Yeah, this bitch was out to make me miserable. In fact, other than the 200 IM, I wasn't swimming anything I wanted. Since as stated multiple times throughout the series, I absolutely dreaded the 100 backstroke and 100 butterfly, especially given the fact that my coach seemed to only put me in these events just to fuck with me. Now, initially, we didn't know that I was in this meet until the morning of, since my parents of course didn't sign me up for it. However, around that time that warm-up occurred, they got a phone call from my coach asking where I was. My parents were extremely confused since they didn't sign me up. But that's when my coach revealed that he signed me up for the meet and I would have 3 events plus the medley relay. He said that if I did not attend, I would be letting down not just myself, but the whole team since we wouldn't be able to participate in the medley. My parents then hung up and then talked to me about it, as well as cursed my coach for signing me up for a meet we didn't sign up for and then getting upset that I wasn't there. But now, we had a decision to make. I could either go to the meet and swim my worst and least favorite events, or I could miss out and let the team down. After talking with my parents, we decided not to attend the meet because of course I gave up on meets 2 months prior. As a result, I did not have any times recorded, nor did my team get to participate in the medley relay. Interestingly, my coach didn't sign Zoe up, so I don't know why he only signed me up other than to screw me over. Now, of course, as you can expect, when I didn't show up, my coach was absolutely furious. As a result, he decided to make practice the following Monday absolute hell. He had me do all those events I previously missed at the meet and other difficult stuff too. But the worst part was that at the end of practice, he forced me to go to the other 3 boys swimming in the medley and apologize to them. All 3 of them were a part of the upper level swimmers group, so they had practice from 5:30 to 7, unlike me who had practice from 4:30 to 5:45. So, that's what happened. I apologized to them like my coach told me to. However, all 3 of them were really cool about it. They understood that I didn't sign up for the meet and that our coach put me in the meet himself, so they were cool with me missing out on the medley. In fact, they even thanked me for doing so, as it levied a lot of stress our coach put on them. All 3 of these boys would go on to quit the team by the end of the summer, and 2 of them even quit swimming altogether, just in case you needed reassurance of how awful my coach was. I too would of course leave the team, and I'll talk about quitting the team later in the story time and talk about the effect it had on the team. Alright, so that's enough with regards to swimming. Let's move on back to school. My first day back was Wednesday, January 2nd. So with it being the turn of the new semester, that meant new classes. Well, some new classes. I would still have English, seminar, and crew, since those were year-long classes, but I would also begin a new math class, that of course being Algebra 2. So as mentioned before, those who took Algebra 1 back in 8th grade got to take Geometry their first semester in 9th grade, and then Algebra 2 their second semester in 9th grade. At public schools, you only take 1 math class a year, so this placed us much further ahead of public school students. As for our teacher, it was the same one from Algebra 2, so we still got to have him for the rest of the school year. So, that was my only new high school class this semester. I would also have completely different college classes, but I'll explain those later since college classes didn't start until Tuesday, January 15th. For now, let's talk about the third intensive we did freshman year. So for it, we talked about bridges, and by bridges, I mean literal bridges, ones that take you from one place to another. Yeah, those bridges. So we did this intensive entirely on Thursday, January 3rd. That morning, we reported the seminar first and did our mystery piece. This part of the intensive worked practically the same as the intensive back from October, so most of us kind of knew what was coming up. Anyways, we of course started with the common piece. So each group was given one of those mystery piece charts, and we had to write down our notices and wonders from the common piece. The common piece was just a picture of a bridge not too far from campus. Afterwards, we were taken to a nearby classroom and did the gallery walk. Here, a multitude of pictures of small as well as large bridges were on display. When we got back to the classroom, we didn't jot down our notices and wonders for the gallery walk. Then we were given some expert files. These files included actual articles about bridges and history regarding bridge architecture. We didn't jot our notices and wonders for it. Finally came our guess for what we were going to discuss. Virtually everyone said bridges, and we were of course correct, as we were going to be talking about bridges for this intensive. Now, even though I thoroughly enjoyed doing intensives back in high school and enjoy looking back on them, I do often question why my school had us doing this intensive. With every other intensive excluding our first one, they were all trying to achieve part of the expeditionary learning curriculum and answer our grade's primary question. Like for freshman year's question of who am I, the history of our city fits in well because understanding our upbringing and why we're used to the place we live in can help us better understand ourselves. And in parts 6 and 7, when I talk about the intensives in sophomore and junior years, they will fit with their respective question. But with this intensive, I've never really understood what the point of going over physical bridges was, given that this grade's question is about discovering ourselves and figuring out who we were rather than becoming civil engineers. I guess this does make a little sense when I discuss the paper we wrote in English that went alongside this intensive, but like for the intensive itself, I really don't get what the point of this intensive was. So getting back on track, after we finished the gallery walk, we were all gathered into the multi-purpose room, but rather than going on a field trip for this intensive, we would instead stay at school and do an activity, although we still got out of class that day. Anyways, for next hour, we watched this episode from one TV show about two teams competing against each other over who can build the best bridge. They had to build a bridge sturdy enough to get an F-150 from one landmass to another, all while being constrained on time and money. It wasn't the worst show, but considering the contestants went into pretty high detail about all the calculations and other crazy math that engineers do, that was way over the top of my head at the time, it got quite overwhelming and boring. But after finishing it, our teachers then opened the floor for discussion, where we got to pretty much verbally say our notices and wonders and talk about the show. I didn't pay attention, so I didn't participate that much. Afterwards, it was lunchtime, so we ate lunch, and then after lunch, we gathered back into seminar in order to move on to the next thing. So for it, we pretty much got to do a competition like this ourselves, just that instead of trying to build a bridge to withstand the weight of an F-150, we were trying to build a bridge that could withstand the weight of a palm. The bridge had to be made with toothpicks and marshmallows, so we didn't have the sturdiest materials to our disposal. In addition, we were constrained to the amount of materials we could use. Pretty much how this competition worked was that each group was given a budget, and they can use their balance to quote-unquote buy materials. So this interesting spin definitely made what was already a tough challenge even more difficult. As for my team, I was in a team with 3 girls. One of the girls took the role as the leader, so she was in charge of leading the group and managing everything. Another girl offered to be the budgeter, so she was in charge of making sure our bridge was satisfying our budgeting constraints and pretty much acting like our accountant. The third girl was in charge of execution, so while all of us participated in the actual construction of the bridge, she took the role of leading us in that part. And then I was the architect, so my job was to come up with the bridge design while also calculating the resources necessary that the budgeter could make decisions. So therefore, I can safely say that we as a group were very effective and had a great strategy coming in, since we were of course divided our roles in order to get the job done, almost kind of like how most businesses are structured, where you have your accounting and finance department, your supply chain department, your cybersecurity department, human resources department, board of directors, marketing department, and so many other departments that all come together to keep the business running. As for the end result, well, unfortunately, that was a failure. I think I focused a lot more on design over physics, as I designed the bridge to look similar to the famous bridges like the Golden Gate Bridge and the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. Of course, while these bridges are effective in withstanding the amount of traffic they have on a daily basis, their designs were specifically created for their purposes and size. So therefore, I shouldn't have compared this exercise to those bridges and instead try to figure out if the bridge could withstand a palm. Nonetheless, after that exercise, it was time to go home, so we cleaned up and went home. Now, unlike the previous intensive, this intensive did not have a project to go along with it, so we didn't create a huge poster or anything like that. In fact, we never really did anything with this intensive outside of course the day we did it, as well as in English. So in English, we talked about bridges, but rather than talking about physical bridges like what the intensive focused on, we talked about figurative bridges. Figurative bridges are pretty much people who connect us to new ideas, things, and basically people who encourage us to grow. So for this intensive in English, we had to write a 5-paragraph essay about who our bridge was. I chose to do it about Mom, since I learned a ton and experienced a lot of different things thanks to her. However, this would ultimately go down as one of the worst papers I've ever written. I criticized Mom quite harshly and the paper itself was super unprofessional, but for some reason, my teacher seemed to disagree with me, as she enjoyed reading it and gave me a 100. In fact, this essay came up when we were talking about it on my last day of high school, roughly 3 years after I wrote this paper, since she and the other freshman teachers were getting ready to do this intensive the next month. She said that she enjoyed reading it and didn't think there was anything wrong with it. Maybe I'm being too harsh on myself, but looking back, I remember this was a god-awful paper. Now, staying on the topic of English, we also began reading our 3rd book in the class. So the book that we were reading was The Joy Luck Club. I remember honestly not having the best experience reading this book, as while the chapters are supposed to not be in chronological order, I feel like the author could have still done a better job connecting the chapters together. I talk about another book that I read in 11th grade in part 7 that does the same concept but in a much better format, and I'll talk about how that book even inspired the format for my book. Anyways, The Joy Luck Club was basically a book about 4 women who moved to the United States from China right before dictator Mao Zedong takes power. Each of them pretty much takes turns telling a story from either their experience growing up in China or their initial move to the United States, as they are telling these stories roughly 20 years after they moved to the US. Once again, it's a weird book that I don't really remember too much from, although I do remember a project we did regarding this book that I'll discuss when we get to February. So now let's move on to lunch. So now that I had a phone again, I could of course use it during lunch, since the phone policy at my school was a lot more relaxed than other schools. Like at my school, if you need to take a phone call during class, the teachers will let you leave class to take the phone call. They're really cool about phone usage, just as long as you aren't using them while they're teaching. I know at Zoe's school, phones are not allowed anywhere, not even during lunch, so I'm glad my school has a good phone policy. Now the reason I bring this up is because from here to the end of the semester and pretty much throughout the time we ate in the hallway during lunch, me, Dylan, our friend Edward, and our friend Jackson would all get together and play a game called Geometry Dash. I don't really need to explain this game too much in detail since alongside Storytimes, I literally record Geometry Dash demon completions. But if you need to know anything about the game, it's that you die a ton and the game is very hard. For example, the hardest level I've ever beaten in Geometry Dash is a level called Fairy Dust, and it took me almost 8,000 attempts to beat over the course of 1.5 years. I'll have my completion for it linked in the description since I also had probably my greatest video game reaction ever when I beat it. But this isn't 2022, this is the beginning of 2019. At the time, I had only beat up to Dryout, one of the main levels, so I was of course still a noob, but so was Dylan, Edward, and Jackson, so we all sucked at the game together. However, let's just say that we raged and joked about the game pretty much all the time during lunch. From us saying as many bad words as we could, to me and Jackson both almost breaking our phones trying to beat Can't Let Go. So we raged pretty hard, but it was still really fun since we were of course all playing the game together, and these sessions would go on to encourage me to be at a demon level, the hardest levels in the game, at the end of 2019. So that's how lunch was going. Really, the first couple of weeks of January were very easy and uneventful outside of swimming since college classes hadn't started yet. So we were being dismissed at 2:30 every day and not really doing a whole lot. However, the second half of January would prove to be a lot more eventful. I particularly want to focus on Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, which lasted from Saturday, January 19th to Monday, January 21st. This was the weekend before our college classes started. I should also mention that unlike public schools, our Martin Luther King break was only MLK Day, not the extra Tuesday and Wednesday, so unfortunately, still had school on those days. But anyways, I bring this weekend up because this weekend, I attended a church trip called Winter Retreat 2019. So, as mentioned, I was still in the process of trying to fix my friendships with those that left me out at Fuge. And while high school guys' small group was a failure, I figured that maybe going to this retreat would help. Unfortunately, I would end up having the same thing happen here that happened at Fuge, and as a result, I developed a good bit of religious trauma from this trip as well. Now, I discussed Winter Retreat 2018 back in part 4. It was a fun trip, given that it was 5 months before Fuge happened, and also kind of shines as a light spot during such a dark time in my life. However, this year, Winter Retreat would be a lot different than the previous year. Rather than making it for the entire youth group, our church decided to just make it a high school only trip, so only 9th through 12th graders. Initially, this was especially great for me since it would allow me to get closer with those my grade and try to regain my friendship with them. However, as things would turn out, that would fail. Another thing that made this year's Winter Retreat different is that instead of sleeping in hotel rooms, our church rented out this massive vacation home in Gatlinburg for the weekend. This home had an absolute shit ton of bedrooms, 2 living rooms, a very large kitchen, a gym, an indoor swimming pool, a hot tub, multiple movie theaters, and the house itself was absolutely massive, since it was built for stuff like this. Additionally, rather than attending big-ass sessions like what we did at Winter Retreat 2018, we instead did our own. So my church, being as large as it was, had a pretty large youth group. The youth group was so large that it had a praise band and performed during youth every Wednesday night. So for our quote-unquote big-ass sessions for this trip, we brought the praise band along and they played some songs. All of us gathered in one of the living rooms where the praise band would play some songs and then our youth pastor gave a lesson. Just like Winter Retreat 2018, we had 4 of these sessions, although the 3rd session would work much differently than the others, and I'll talk about how that was when we get there. Alright, so with that said, let's talk about the trip. So just like Winter Retreat 2018, they let us sleep in a little bit the morning of the trip, as we didn't take off for Tennessee until noon. However, because it was just exclusively high schoolers attending this trip, the church didn't rent out the big coach bus that they use for Fuge, so we unfortunately didn't get to travel in luxury. Instead, we used the church's vans. The van I rode in consisted of 15 of us 9th graders, so I figured that this would be the perfect opportunity to talk to everyone. However, upon boarding the van, I realized that this was going to be much harder than expected. Nobody invited me to sit with them, which didn't surprise me too much. However, there was an empty seat beside some guy who I'd never seen before, so I asked him if anyone was sitting beside him. While he probably wanted to resist, he still obliged, so I sat beside him for the ride up there. I tried to start a conversation with him, but he clearly didn't want anything to do with me, so for the rest of the trip, I simply ignored him and tried to talk to everyone else on the bus. But neither of them wanted anything to do with me either, so I gave up and whipped out my DS and played some Pokemon White 2 until we stopped. As for where we stopped, that would have been the Asheville Mall. So, Asheville was pretty much our halfway point. Here there's a large mall that included a Chick-fil-A, which actually is the same Chick-fil-A we ate at when we stopped here back at Winter Retreat 2018. So we stopped here and ate some good old Jesus chicken. Once we were done eating, we were allowed to walk around the mall, just that we had to meet back up with everyone else at a certain time, so I simply walked around the mall by myself. This actually could have gotten me in trouble, since my church was one of those churches that thinks being introverted is a sin, thanks to their narrow-minded and misinterpretation of the Bible. So if my youth pastor or another youth leader found out about me walking around the mall alone, they likely would have been upset. After crossing the Tennessee border, maneuvering through the Great Smoky Mountains, and getting off of I-40, we finally reached Gatlinburg and therefore reached our destination. Then came the worst part of this trip, settling in. So after getting our stuff unloaded, we moved on to getting our living arrangement set up. The girls were taken down to the basement while us guys were taken upstairs. Now, upstairs there were multiple bedrooms, but there was also a game room that also included pool tables, air hockey tables, and even some arcade machines. But more importantly, there were 8 bunks, equating to 16 beds. All the other freshman guys headed over there, so I figured that I would join them, especially since all the bedrooms were taken up. So I went up and joined them. Now, when I arrived, all the beds had been taken except for one. So I went up to the guy who was on the lower bunk if he was cool with me using the upper bunk. He said that that bunk was reserved, so therefore, I was without a bunk. Considering that the bedrooms had already been taken, I realized that I was left with no bed. I had just been fuged again. So therefore, I set my things down on the floor and set up my own space. I got out my blanket and pillow and created my own personal sleeping space, that being the hard wooden floor, all in front of everyone else. Yeah, this was very embarrassing. The same feelings I felt at Fuge were the same feelings I was feeling here. My goal here was to try to redeem my friendships with everyone, and already it was failing and we were just starting the trip. And remembering what happened at Fuge as I was carrying, and do y'all remember what happened at Fuge as I was carrying a mattress from another room to the other room? Can you guess what happened next? If you guessed I got made fun of and questioned, you'd be right. The guys around me started questioning me, and then of course, they laughed at me, only making me feel more shitty and regretting even considering going here. But here's where the real shit starts. So a little while later, our youth pastor came up to check on us. When he saw that I had my stuff set up on the floor, he came over and questioned why I had my stuff down there. I told him that all the other beds were taken and that I had no other choice. That's when he noticed the one guy who said that his bed was reserved. So he went over there and asked him if I could have the other bed. And I kid you not, this dumbass literally said that it was free and that could happen. What in the actual fuck? Just 5 minutes earlier, he said that the bed was reserved, but now that our youth pastor was here, it's now open? What a dick move. If my religious trauma wasn't already bad enough, this sure made it worse than what Fuge made it. Like, come on man, it's just a bunk bed. It's not like I'm forcing you to be my friend. No, I just need a bed to sleep on, and you won't even offer me that. What would Jesus have done? I'm sure he would have graciously offered me his other bed, not lie to my face and then make me look like a complete idiot in front of everyone, you fucking dumbass piece of shit. So yeah, I got fuged again. I mean, sure, this is definitely not as bad as having to wait outside my room every day for my roommates to come in and unlock the door, but it still sucked and pretty much made me realize that these guys haven't changed since then. In fact, I'm sure none of them changed even 5 years later, given that this is a Baptist church, aka modern day Pharisees and Sadducees. So yeah, looks like redeeming my friendship certainly wasn't happening. Anyways, after we got settled in, we were provided with some free time. During this free time, my youth pastor, who probably could guess what happened, decided to get my help in setting up his Switch in one of the living rooms, since he knew I was also pretty good at video games. At first, this is a little bit of an issue since this was before I got my Switch, which I'll discuss in part 6. But considering hooking up a Switch is practically the same process as hooking up a Wii U for any of the other 3 people who have had one, it wasn't too difficult. He then offered to play around a Smash Bros. With me, but I declined since I'd never really played Smash Ultimate at the time. But once the Switch was hooked up, it was available for anyone who wanted to play it, and a lot of people did play it. I didn't, as I simply did my own thing, but at least it was up for anyone who wanted to play Smash Bros. A few hours later, it was time for dinner. This house also had a huge kitchen with a very long dining table, so we all sat there for dinner. I can't remember what we had for dinner, so I won't comment on it. Afterwards, it was time for our first big-ass session. So simply all that happened was that everyone gathered into one of the living rooms, the praise band played a few songs, and then our youth pastor gave a lesson. And just like all the other church trips I attended, with the exception of D Now 2021 that I'll discuss in part 7, I do not remember any of the lessons we did, so I of course won't talk about them here. After the big ass session, we had free time for the rest of the night. During this time, I made one more attempt to talk to those in my grade, but it failed, so I gave up and went and take a shower. By the way, I was like the only guy in our grade who took a shower. Like, I didn't see anyone else go to the bathroom to take one, so if anyone needs proof that I'm not the crazy one, this is also proof. Lights out were out at 12, so once it hit midnight, the lights were all turned off and we all went to bed. Well, we got in bed. We didn't have to fall asleep. And as you can guess, I nor did anyone fall asleep since midnight is pretty early. So while I just laid there, the other boys began chatting. However, that's when one kid started to bring up some, let's just say, not Christian friendly stuff. He particularly started talking about masturbating, or beating his meat as he referred to it as. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about this stuff since I want to keep the Storytime rated R and not XXX, but I'll just say that he and the other guys started going on about things like the longest they've gone without doing it, as well as their favorite, let's just say, not safe for church actress. I stayed quiet because not only had I already given up making friends, but I wasn't really open to talk about dirty subjects back then like I am today. However, that's when that kid who started this conversation decided that he was actually going to do it. So he announced it to everyone in the room, and then we all watched him walk into one of the bathrooms to jerk off. By the way, this game room had 2 bathrooms, with one on each end of the room. This kid went to the one nearest to him, which is also the one nearest to me. So he went in there, did it for the next 10 minutes while everyone else joked around and laughed. And the best part is that we could actually hear what he was doing it too. Especially once we heard that also famous intro from that very interesting website all of us have probably visited at least once in our lifetime. Then once he exited the bathroom, everyone clapped and cheered for him on as he went back to bed. And then we all laughed and decided that for the rest of the trip, we were not going to use that bathroom. The only issue would be whenever our youth pastor or another youth leader came up, but we ultimately decided to stay quiet regarding it, which, looking back on it, was definitely a good choice since we tried to prevent our youth pastor or leader from going into that bathroom. We would look really suspicious doing so. So then that brings me to Sunday, January 20th. We were all woken up by our youth pastor at 7:30, who invited us all to breakfast. So we all went downstairs and ate breakfast, and then did our second big-ass session. However, during this big-ass session, there were 2 boys in my grade who were absent. At first, nobody batted an eye. However, that's when we heard a rather loud moan come from upstairs. The stairs were in between 2 living rooms, so we could hear a little bit of what was happening upstairs. So, a youth leader got up to see what was going on. And sure enough, he ended up catching these 2 boys doing something that I feel would be a little bit too much even for story time. So I'm not going to comment on what they were doing. But anyways, you'll come to know that my church had strong views regarding purity culture as well as same-sex relationships, which is part of the reason I left this church. So it shouldn't come to anyone's surprise that these 2 boys got themselves into some pretty serious trouble. I don't exactly know what they were punished with, since I only know about this story from hearing the moan as well as from overhearing people gossip about it, but I assume it was something pretty strict. However, when we get to March, we'll see one of these boys did not learn his lesson, as he would do something very disgusting to me that I'll get to then. So after that, we had some more free time and then ate lunch, but after lunch, we took off from the house and did something that those who saw part 4 might remember, the choice between go-karting and shopping. Just like what I did during Winter Retreat 2018, I went go-karting. Now, in part 4, when I talk about go-karting, I mentioned that it was extremely cold that day, and sure enough, it was also really cold here, with the high being 27 degrees. Yeah, that's cold. Like here in Charlotte, during January, the high is usually in the high 50s and low 60s, so for the high to be below freezing is like stupid cold for me. So as you can expect, I ended up having the same experience go-karting that I had in 2018. While it was fun, my hands and face were freezing off and I was just super cold. Like, not even my gloves or very fluffy jacket could keep me warm, as it was genuinely that cold. But at least afterwards, we went inside and my god did the heat inside feel so good. Like, even though we didn't do much out inside since it was just filled with arcade games that we didn't have money for those, I was just so glad to be in the heat and warmed up. Afterwards, those who chose to go shopping met back with us here, so we were about to board the vans and head back home. However, that's when someone decided to bet against the kid who went to the bathroom the night before. He offered this kid $20 to jump into the nearby pond. Mind you, this was outside in 27-degree weather, so this pond was frozen over since it was below freezing. And I shit you not, that kid actually took him up on the offer and actually jumped into the pond. Everyone, including our youth pastor and the youth leaders, began dying laughing as he quickly got out of the pond, where our laughter became rounds of applause. Conveniently, our youth pastor had a towel in one of the vans, so we handed that kid a towel while the guy who betted him gave him a $20 bill. Pretty difficult way to earn $20, given the high chance of frostbite, but hey, $20 is $20, and that kid sure earned it. Then once we got back to the house, we had some more free time on our hands. And the kid who jumped into the pond got dried off, and he also actually took a shower, so I take that back what I said earlier. He also took a shower, but I was like the only one who like actually took a shower and would have taken a shower even if I didn't jump into a pond. But then a little while later, our youth pastor announced that we were going to attend a big ass session like the ones we went to 2018. Basically, for those who didn't see that story time, how big ass sessions worked at Winter Retreat 2018 was that there were full-blown concerts. So during the 4 we attended, a famous Christian band did a concert and well-known pastor gave a sermon. This event was actually going on during our trip in 2019, just that we weren't signed up for them. However, our youth pastor managed to talk to the owner of that organization that host these, giving us tickets to attend them, to which she obliged and provided us tickets to a concert. So that's what we did for our third big ass session. We went over to the conference center and attended this concert. Now, unlike the ones from 2018, I do not remember who played at this one. The reason is because I really didn't want to attend this big ass session in the first place. I was quite tired, and especially after everything that happened the day before, as well as of course freezing to death earlier that day, I was very much out of it. So as a result, I barely did anything during this big ass session. I almost fell asleep, but managed to stay awake for the full session. At least once it was finished, we headed back to the house where I could finally take a shower and go to bed. Seems like the others were tired too, as they also went to bed early, which worked great for me. So then that brings me to the last day of Winter Retreat 2019, being Monday, January 21st. We of course started with breakfast and then did our last big ass session, which was just like the first two. Nothing sus happened during the session, so after it, we got packed up and then head back home. After a 4-hour drive, we made it back to church, and after Mom and Dad picked me up, I could finally get back home. Ultimately, while a lot of funny, dirty stuff happened, Winter Retreat 2019 was an absolute failure of a trip. I not only failed to redeem my friendship with those in my grade, but my relationship with them got worse, and as a result of this trip, especially after that senior teamed up with them and pretty much fuged me again, honestly, I wish I never attended this trip, as it was genuinely that bad that I had very little enjoyment from it. As a result, I decided to promise myself that I would never attend another church trip again, so that meant no more winter retreats, D-nows, or fuges. I would keep this promise to myself for a little over 2 years, and I'll talk about what caused me to break this promise with myself in part 7. So with that all discussed, let's get back to school. So unlike everyone else who didn't return to school until Thursday, January 24th, I had to go back to school that Tuesday, so I didn't really get any rest like what I wanted. However, Tuesday, January 22nd would be a very important day, since it would be the first day of college classes for spring 2022 semester, so let's talk about each class individually. To start, I'm going to talk about Communications 110, that being Intro to Communications. This class met on Mondays and Wednesdays. It was, as you can guess, an introduction to communications and how people interact with one another. I found it a pretty interesting class, and considering that this was also a Gen Ed, I'd recommend it if you're a college student in need of a general elective class, since it's also really easy. Now, the professor for this class was also really cool. Even though she, of course, was older than us, being roughly double our ages, she was very up-to-date on slang and other pop culture that didn't sound too awkward. She also was really funny, often cracking jokes and just being a really fun person to be around, so she was really cool. Additionally, she also gave us a ton of freedom in class and treated us like actual college students, so we didn't have to ask to use the bathroom, and she didn't even take attendance. So yeah, she was awesome. Now, how our class worked was that while part of our grade was based on doing assignments and stuff, the majority of it was based around 4 tasks that we did throughout the semester. These tasks could range from a multitude of different things, so it's kind of difficult to give an exact definition of these tasks, but I'll discuss the first task when we get to February, so hopefully then y'all can kind of get an understanding for what tasks consist of. Now, another class that I took this semester was Health 110, being Personal Health and Wellbeing. This class took place on Tuesdays and Thursdays in the same classroom as PE did, as well as by the same teacher for PE. So just like how all high schoolers have to take a semester of PE, they also have to take a semester of health. And luckily, this class also counted towards health credit we needed for high school, so we received both high school and college credit for this class. As for the professor, it was the same professor for PE, so I didn't need to go into detail about him since he was cool. But as for the content, we pretty much went over personal health. So things like exercise, eating healthy, and other types of physical health, as well as mental health, and of course everyone's favorite, sex ed. Sex ed had an interesting case regarding permission for it, which I'll discuss more about in April. Now, how our grade worked for health was that at the beginning of the class, we would take a 5-question quiz about the information from the previous class. Our quizzes would be averaged out, and that would be our final grade. However, something very sinister happened the night before the last day of class that ended up nullifying all this, which I'll explain when we get there. A third class I took was Business 110, which is Intro to Business. This time for the class was quite interesting, as it was exclusively on Fridays, but it was a 2-hour and 15-minute class, being from 9 a.m. to 11:15, so from right after crew to lunchtime. This class was, as you can expect, an introduction to business, what a business is, how it operates, and different functions of a business. It kind of covered all fields of business, from the practical stuff of what a business is and what a business does to different business fields like management, finance, marketing, and even economics and accounting, but which is what I'm studying at university. So this class pretty much was my introduction to the business world. So it should be pretty interesting for me to look back on it now as someone who will soon graduate with a business degree, especially since I haven't brought up this class in a Storytime since Storytime 43, which I recorded a month before starting university almost 2 years ago. Now, if there's one issue to go ahead and address with this class, it's that this class was so fucking boring. The reason for that is because, as mentioned, it was a 2-hour and 15-minute class. That's a pretty long class, but to be honest, this wasn't nearly as bad as I might think today. As a high schooler, I had quite a lot of endurance regarding sitting through a bunch of lectures, so therefore, a 2-hour and 15-minute class was actually not bad. Unlike me today, who thinks even an hour and 15-minute class is dreadful since my attention span seemed to have drastically decreased in college. But nonetheless, I still found myself getting quite bored in this class. I'd at least find a solution to that in late February, which I'll get to then. As for the professor, he was pretty cool. He had recently retired and now just simply taught part-time. Before he retired, he worked as a CEO at a steel factory in western Pennsylvania, so he also had somewhat of an accent, which we all made fun of him for, while he of course made fun of ours. Me and Isaac happened to sit at the desk right in front of his desk, so he'd often talk to us and use us as feedback for assignments, as well as tell us some funny stories from when he was a CEO. So even though this class was boring, at least he was still cool. Now, for what we did in this class, the first half was dedicated to lectures, so our professor would do a typical lecture about the chapter of the week, but the second half of the class would be a little more eventful, where he would assign us into groups and we had to do some graphical illustration on a whiteboard since the classroom was filled with whiteboards. So we would do these, each being assigned on a certain topic, and then our professor would commentate on our stuff for 10 minutes and then move on. And then after a little while, we were dismissed, and that usually was 15 minutes early, so we get an extra long lunch. As for my fourth class, it wouldn't begin for another week since it was an online class, but since it still started in January, being Monday, January 30th, I figured that I should go ahead and talk about it. So this class was Humanities 160, that being Introduction to Film, or just film as I'll refer to it as. Since World History, as stated earlier, was a year-long class, we got to take 2 different college classes for each semester. Of course, our fall 2018 class was Community Health, so our spring 2019 class was Film. This class basically went over how film criticism works and how a film critic analyzes movies. Now, you'll come to know that I'm not the biggest fan of watching movies. Even though I'm pretty big into anime, I've never been one to watch real-life shows, if you know what I mean. Since to me, real-life shows are just so boring and uneventful, unlike anime where you can watch the craziest and most brutal fights to the death to save the world. And the same goes for movies as well. So therefore, I was not too excited for this course. As for the professor, he was very silly to say the least. Honestly, he wasn't bad, but it's very easy to make fun of him because, well, he had his usual catchphrases and somewhat of a personality despite being an online class. Like every Monday, he would make a video announcement where he would say, "Good morning, film crew," and then introduce him by his full name and a couple other things about him. That would be like me starting every story time by saying, "I'm Zachary James Banner to Charlotte, North Carolina in the southeast region of the United States of America, and you are watching the 56th edition of this YouTube series called Storytime on October the 13th in the year of our Lord 2023. Yeah, that is how he started his Monday announcement videos. Like, instead of doing all that, I just simply say, "I'm Zach and this is Storytime 56 on October 13th, 2023. Because that's all that needs to be said, not my entire life story. But at least it was fun to joke about with everyone else in our class since we all got to mimic him. So, those were my new classes for the semester. Other than that stuff, as well as intensives, nothing really happened during January with regards to academics. But before I move on to February, I want to bring up swimming once again. So at this point, I was beginning to increasingly hate swimming more and more. I was sick of my coach's bullshit and was ready to quit. And of course, as I stated earlier, Zoe felt the same way and so did Mom. However, Dad wanted us to keep swimming, claiming we would grow fat if we didn't swim, so therefore, we still had to swim. However, he would at least agree to let us swim less. Of course, back in 2018, I and Zoe both stopped swimming meets, but after in late January, we would only begin attending 3 practices a week, Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. This would go on to anger our coach intensively, since we were of course skipping 2 practices a week, which in his mind made us failures as a team. So he would often use our attendance against us during practices and talk about how we were never going to be better and stuff, which really put a toll on my well-being and attitude. But another thing that we tried to do was to levy me down to the lowest group on the team. So the team was split into 5 levels, with level 1 being the slowest and level 5 being the fastest. The level 1s and 2s were the lowest leveled swimmers, while the levels 3s, 4s, and 5s were the upper level swimmers, which is the terminology I used back in part 3. I had been sitting at a level 2 since March of 2017, despite the fact that I was faster than half of the level 3s. Anyways, levels 1 and 2 practice at the same time, while levels 3s, 4, and 5 have practice together. Those boys from the relay group that I didn't attend were all level 3s. Now, the main difference between the levels were practice times. So for every level you are, your practice time is increased by 15 minutes. So level 1s have a practice time of an hour, while level 2s have practice times of an hour and 15 minutes, and so on. Therefore, my parents agreed to let me be moved down to level 1 so I would only have an hour of practice per practice. It also helped that Zoe was a level 1 the entire time she was on the team, so it would be more convenient for Mom with regards to us leaving the practice at the same time. And so when they emailed my coach asking me to move me down to level 1, he surprisingly agreed, meaning I was only swimming for an hour each practice. Well, if only that happened. You see, the following practice, he decided that he was going to be just as much of an asshole as he was during meets. To start, he had me swim with all the other level 2s. At first, I didn't think much of this because I already was the fastest level 2 on the team by far. However, when it came time for when he dismissed level 1s, I of course got out with the others, but that's when he came over and stopped me and said that despite being a level 1, I was still required to swim for the whole hour and 15 minutes. This immensely confused me since that was literally why I was moved down, but I ended up listening to him and stayed for the extra 15 minutes. Then when Mom came and picked me up, she was really confused as to why I was still at practice, so I told her, which annoyed her a ton since this was literally why we wanted to have me be a level 1. So she emailed our coach asking him why he was keeping me as an extra 15 minutes, and our coach pretty much reiterated what he said to me in the email. There wasn't any way of battling against this, so I unfortunately still had to swim for an extra 15 minutes a day. Ultimately, this was a failure because not only did it make my feelings about swimming worse, but it completely demoralized me since I was now a level 1 despite having the speed of a level 3. Yeah, that definitely made me hate the sport even more and would make me absolutely dread every practice I attended. Anyways, let's move on to February. February is almost always the worst month for me mentally. Not too sure why, but February is just the worst month of the year by far. And that would ultimately be the case for me in 2019. But being the best year of my life, this year's February would not be as bad as February usually is, but it still sucked, so let's get to it. To start, let's discuss academics. So in English, we finished reading the Joy Luck Club and could move on to its project, the Yaya Box. First off, what the fuck is a Yaya Box? Well, pretty much it's a box that's supposed to represent a character from a book or show. The outside of the box is supposed to represent that character on the outside, what the other characters know about them, and how they seem to act on the outside. The inside of the box is supposed to symbolize the character's inside, so things like their thoughts and true beliefs that only we, the audience, get to see. The way the book is structured is that each woman who takes turns telling a story reveals a lot about themselves, as well as how they treat family and other stuff. So therefore, we could pick virtually any character and have a lot to put on the outside and inside. Now, because this was a pretty big project that took quite a bit of time, we worked in groups and were given 2 weeks to complete these. So for the next 2 weeks in English, as well as on Mondays during seminar, they were spent working on Yaya boxes. This would actually prove to be a good thing regarding mine and my English teacher's relationship, since we never interacted during this time since I was busy working on the box. And yes, I did in fact contribute to this box. While I didn't go above and beyond, I still provided some materials and also helped with the construction of the box. It wasn't a huge role, but it was still an important role nonetheless, and I still contributed to the project. We had an artistic girl in our group who designed the thing and drew most of the stuff, so we let her be the leader while the rest of us followed her orders. Now, what character were we assigned? Well, my group was assigned Lindo Zhang. Of course, it's been almost half a decade now since I've read this book and did the Yaya box, so my mind might be very fuzzy trying to remember it. But from what I recall, Lindo Zhang was a very stubborn character known for always being one in charge. That's really all I can remember about her, as I don't really remember much about the book. As for the box, I also don't remember it all that much either, but from what I do remember, the outside of the box had a horse since Lindo Zhang's birth year was 1914, that being the year of the horse. On the inside, while I forgot what stuff in particular that we used, I do remember that we used a lot of string and cotton. Overall, the project looked very nice, and our teacher even said that it was one of the best Yaya boxes she had ever received. In fact, during the interest meeting that our school hosts yearly for interested 8th graders, she even used that box to represent the type of work we do. So it's safe to say that we did well on it if the 100 wasn't enough proof. So now let's move on to algebra. So in algebra, we were assigned a project called the birthday polynomial. Pretty much what we had to do for this project was that we had to create a complex polynomial based on numbers from our birthday. We also had to include some other information too. So alongside mentioning my birthday, being June 21st, 2004, I also included some other stuff like my favorite numbers, my zodiac sign, that being Gemini, and some other stuff. Now, using these facts, I was able to create a pretty massive polynomial. And by massive, I mean my polynomial was 512x to the 4th minus 1664x cubed plus 328x squared plus 164x plus 12. Or in factored form, 2x minus 6 times 4x minus 2 times 8x plus 1 squared. Yeah, that's a pretty big polynomial. Unfortunately, I don't remember exactly where I got these numbers from, so I can't comment on creating the equation. However, what I can comment on is the effort I put into this project, because my god did I put so much effort into this thing. So alongside creating a polynomial, we also had to create a half sheet, a poster presenting our numbers and facts, and believe me, I was absolutely dedicated to this thing. Like, I spent so much time on it that I even went to my teacher's room doing smart lunch, which I never utilized. He would often provide extra materials and even help me color the posters since he saw how dedicated I was to this thing. And ultimately, this thing came out beautifully, which is why I consider this to be my best piece of work from my freshman year of high school. By the way, in parts 6, 7, and 8, I'll mention what I consider to be my greatest project of the year, so you can kind of see how my projects evolved throughout my time at early college. I would of course go on to make a 100 on this project, given that even my teacher helped me out with it since he saw how invested I was in it. He would also hang it on the wall too, so everyone got to see my greatest project from 9th grade for the rest of the school year. Now let's talk a little bit about crew. So during this month, we did the 4th project of the Big 5 mentioned earlier. This was the crew shield. For it, we pretty much had to design a shield with artwork and everything, similar to that of the crew flag, but a different design and on a circle object and on a flag. And honestly, I don't have too much to say about it because I didn't contribute to it at all. All I remember is that our shield had a treasure map on it that said find your true north. We didn't showcase our shield during Closing Circle, but my only role in it was holding up the shield, so I never really did much. However, I do recall one day where I and 2 juniors got into a little bit of trouble. So at the beginning of crew, one day, me and the other 2 were on our phones doing random stuff. However, that's when our teacher called us and had us bring our phones to her desk. So we did that, and wow was I scared. I was worried that she was going to take our phones to the front office and mom or dad was going to have to go to the school, pick up my phone, and then ground me for a long time. However, the juniors were very calm in handing their phones to her, so I asked them why. Let's just say that I was very relieved to hear what they said. They said that this was only for the class, as at the end of crew, we could take our phones back. Apparently, this happened to them before, so I immediately felt calm knowing I would get my phone back at the end of class. And sure enough, I did, as we simply just went by our teacher's desk and got our phones, and that was the end of it. Now, also in crew, we did a project for the booklet. So throughout this month, outside of the contribution of the crew shield, we discussed rites of passages and why they're important and stuff. Of course, one of the most common of these are birthdays. And what happens on your birthday? Other than being a year closer to death, you also receive gifts. So for a crew project, we had to create and give a gift to someone in crew. We got to choose who we wanted to give a gift to and who we received one from. I teamed up with my friend Hunter, a junior whom I've been friends with since the beginning of crew. So we both got to work. Now, these gifts had to be handmade, so we couldn't just go to the store and buy something. We could buy materials and create something, but the gift had to be handmade. As for what I made for Hunter, I honestly don't remember. However, I do remember what Hunter made for me. So, Hunter was also a Geometry Dash fan, as he would often join me and the other freshmen in the hallway and we would play Geometry Dash together. So for his gift, he drew a picture of Finger Dash, the last main level in the game, as well as the level that I and everyone else was really invested in. I'd go on to be the first person to beat it, as well as of course the first person to beat a demon level, but at the time, I was still at roughly the same skill as everyone else. But nonetheless, the picture looked great and me and Hunter often joke about it for the rest of the school year. So, that's all that happened for high school classes. Let's discuss college classes. I'll start with communications. So this month, we did our first task. As mentioned earlier, we did 4 tasks that ranged from a vast multitude of different stuff. For task 1, we had to write a reflection paper. So we were pretty much given a set of 7 questions, and we were required to answer 4 of them in essay format. A good majority of them were mostly reflection questions, where we kind of reflected on our own lives and connected some to the material discussed in class. These have always been my favorite type of assignments, since I'm of course a writer who writes about his personal experiences. Albeit, this was only 2 years after I began writing and 2 years before Storytime, but even prior to the conceptualization of Storytime, I still often did private writings about myself on occasion, although it was mostly about video games. So needless to say, I was pretty excited about doing this assignment. And sure enough, I was, as I finished the whole thing the day it was announced. Yeah, I was so excited about this project that I wrote the entire thing on the day it was due. It was also a very fun project to do because I got to reflect back on my life, especially over the past year, since my life from February 2018 to 2019 had pretty much taken an entire 180. Therefore, those who have seen part 4 will likely recognize a lot of things I'll be discussing when talking about this project. So let's dive into each question that I answered and talk about each one. So, the first question, I had to write about a time where I or someone else perceived someone or a group of people incorrectly. For the question, I decided to write about the bullies from 8th grade. I talked about how I initially expected to be around other like-minded people who were serious about school, given that I was in accelerated classes. However, the bullies of course were nothing like that, and instead were of course bullies. I didn't go into crazy detail, but I mentioned that I horribly perceived the bullies initially since I expected them to be more mature and more like me rather than a bunch of mean and arrogant bastards. For the next question, I had to describe a self-fulfilling prophecy that ended up coming true. For it, I decided to write about the conflict at church, specifically after the whole incident at Fuge, and talked about how afterwards, despite trying to be friends with them again, I had a gut feeling that they were going to continue to treat me like shit. Sure enough, they did in fact happen at Winter Retreat, and they pretty much did the same thing to me that they did at Fuge, only that they also got a senior to initiate it. So I chose to write about it, which was actually really interesting for me to do since I had never disclosed this incident to anyone before, and it wouldn't be until 2 years later when I publicly disclosed this incident in Storytime 7. For the third question, I had to write about self-disclosure. For this question, I had to describe 2 stories, one in which disclosing something benefited me, and one time it harmed me. For the benefiting one, I got really personal with it and talked about March 8th, 2018. I discussed this day and the events leading up to it in part 4, but pretty much this was by far the worst day of my whole life, as it was the day that I tried to kill myself. And since the 1-year anniversary since that day was coming up, I figured that this would be a good time to reflect on it, and talk about what made me different a year after the incident. I'll talk more about the 1-year anniversary when we get to March. As for the actual disclosure part, I pretty much talked about revealing my plan and partial attempt to my science teacher, which was of course one of the best things I could have done since she was able to get me set up with a counselor and I was able to get professional help afterwards. Of course, revealing my thoughts and plan and seeing that people wanted to work with me and help me through had a huge impact on me, since it made me realize that there are people who care about me and look after me. This realization is what helped me escape depression entirely and allowed me to live the 2 best years of my life. Now for the negative disclosure, I decided to talk about revealing my uninterest in swimming and wanting to quit the team to my parents. Now, although this would ultimately be a really good one long term, it was not the best one short term wise, as it often resulted in me, Zoe, and Mom getting into fights with Dad. We were slowly but surely getting to the height of this issue, where our fights became more severe than ever, but no matter what we could do, we could never convince Dad to let us quit. Thankfully though, he would ultimately listen a month later, and as a result, this disclosure would actually benefit me far more than it harmed me, but the journey to get there was rough. Then for the final question, it wasn't really a reflection question, it was just more of a discussion question. For it, we had to talk about the Johari window, which is pretty much what is known and what is unknown. So that was just me explaining what it was and not applying it anything to personal life. Overall, I did very well in this task. Even though I did criticize my parents a little bit, it wasn't like I was full on bashing. I spoke about my issues with Dad and swimming in a professional and respectful manner. I was even mature enough to take some responsibility for our arguments regarding swimming as well, so I think I did very well with the project overall. My professor agreed and said herself that she was very impressed with my reflection, giving me a 100 for this assignment. However, someone else who I did not expect to be reading my paper also happened to read it and was impressed. That person just happened to be the principal. So being a school administrator, he had access to all of our stuff in Google Docs, so we decided to take a look at what I was writing, and he was thoroughly impressed with it. So one day during English, he decided to call me to his office. Now, I did not know that he had read my reflection, so when I was told that he wanted to speak to me, I was scared shitless. I thought I was in trouble for something I didn't even know I was in trouble for, so I very anxiously walked over to his office. When I entered his office, he told me to take a seat, which was when my heart began to beat like crazy fast. That's when he first said that I was not in trouble, which immediately made me more calm. But then he told me that he wanted to speak to me for a good reason, which is when my nervousness turned into excitement. That's when he revealed that he was reading through my reflection and communications, and said that he was thoroughly impressed with it, saying that I showed great resilience in the paper and that I had a great talent in both overcoming challenges and writing. He didn't ask me some questions, which thankfully weren't too difficult to answer since he didn't ask anything too personal, and then afterwards, I was dismissed as well as provided with a note that says, "Keep up the good work," and a piece of candy. So yeah, that felt pretty damn awesome coming out of the principal's office for a good reason, and I would of course keep up the good work as he said. Now, of course this happened very soon after we were assigned the task, and we spent the rest of the month working on the task, so while everyone else was finishing up, I spent my time playing Clash of Clans. So moving on from communications, let's talk about film. So in film, we did our first film review. So for this class, we pretty much got to run a blog where we did our assignments. So the assignments could range from basic answering question stuff to full-on film reviews, as we wrote a few of them throughout the year. Then on his blog, he would hold discussion boards, so we would post our responses via the comments. Sometimes bots would get on these, and they could get really funny at times. Like, under a blog where he gave us instructions for a discussion board, a bot replied with, "Great post." And then another bot went onto a discussion board and said, "I know you want to see my naked photos. Click on this link to access all of my hot pussy titty fucking photos on my OnlyFans," alongside being filled with a bunch of kissing, heart, and eggplant emojis. Of course, being a bunch of 14 and 15-year-olds, we found this really funny and joked about it for the rest of the month while our professor tried to get that comment taken down, but he could never figure it out, so it stayed up there for the rest of the semester. Anyways, this month, 2 important things happened during film. The first thing I'll discuss is our first film review. So for it, we pretty much watched a film and then we had to review it. Our professor told us what he wanted us to discuss, and of course we all did a review. For my film, I chose to do a review of a 70s romantic comedy film called Annie Hall. This movie was decent, although still kind of boring since I couldn't relate to the film much given that the characters were all adults and the show was about adult things. But it was decent and still better than most romance films, so it wasn't terrible. After watching it, I then wrote my review of the film and talked about what my professor wanted, and then I submitted it for a review. And unfortunately, he was not too impressed with the review, giving me only a grade of 74. I'm not too sure what I did badly, but I ended up not making very high reviews on my film reviews throughout the semester until one that I did and submitted in April. That review in particular would be the semester project, the other assignment I want to talk about. So the semester project was a massive film review that wasn't as much of a film review as it was a professionally written paper. For it, we had to write a massive paper about a top 100 film from the 1900s, where we pretty much had to go over everything that we learned throughout the class and applied it onto a huge project. Our professor expected us to begin working on it when we were assigned our film, so we made a schedule of stuff due throughout the semester. Most of this stuff were additions to our semester project, not addictions. Although few of them were assignments by themselves that I'll discuss more in March. Anyways, the film that I was assigned was Titanic. We were allowed to choose our films, so I decided to go with this very high-grossing film since not only had I always wanted to see it, but I also didn't want to watch some random black and white movie that was filmed before World War II that I know I would fall asleep to. So therefore, I decided to go with this infamous film that everyone was all crazy about. At the time, this is still the second highest grossing film in the United States, only behind Avatar, since this was just 2 months before Endgame came out and whatever films have grossed higher since then. Once again, I'm not an avid movie watcher, so I don't really know what's all the charts or what's popular now since I'm not a movie watcher. Now, the last thing before I wrap up academics, I also want to talk about a class that many of my friends were taking. So many of my friends, including Dylan, Lucas, Edward, Jackson, Gabby, and more, were taking a class called Technology and Society at the same time I was taking business. We got to choose which of the two we wanted to take as a Friday class, and I ultimately went with business. And thank God I did, because I heard a shit ton of horror stories from my friends at Technology. Apparently, their professor was super rude and especially hated early college students. You'll come to find that there are some professors who either really enjoy teaching early college students or really hate it. This was a professor who really hated early college students, so therefore, he was quite rude to his students and also a very strict grader. His class was pretty much entirely filled with papers, and he graded those papers extremely strictly. If you had even a somewhat incohesive line in your paper, he would take multiple points off. Like, he expected students to write perfectly and pretty much already have mastered their writing style. Mastering one's writing style is a complex process, so complex that I was the only student in our grade to develop and master their own writing style throughout our time at early college, so expecting us to have done this as 9th graders was completely unreasonable and ridiculous. But, additionally, there was some other funny stuff about him, one being that he was really fat. However, it seemed like he could never wear clothes that fit his size, as whenever he would go to the whiteboard to write something down, my friends could also see his lower back and even his ass crack. I'm sure he knows a thing or two about breaking escalators, but all I can say is thank God I never had him as a teacher. So to wrap up February, let's discuss a situation that happened at church that I've never really gone into too much detail about in Storytime. Much of this is because it's of course church, but it's also a very heavy topic for a lot of people, that being sexual harassment. So let's get to it. So back when I discussed Winter Retreat, I talked about 2 boys who got caught playing with each other in a let's just say erotic way. Well, one of those boys is who I want to discuss here. So being a fellow 9th grade guy, he of course was amongst the group of guys that left me out and harassed me at Fuge. He was not involved in the incident at Winter Retreat since he slept in a bedroom, but he was still an asshole nonetheless. However, I'm not sure when it started, but this boy began to make some very uncomfortable comments towards me. For example, I had to see him on Sundays, Mondays, and Wednesdays for Sunday school, small groups, and youth, respectively. Every time he saw me on these days, he would say something like, "Hi Zach, you're a cutie," or "Zach, you're hot." Now, while you might think that I should have taken these as compliments, I really shouldn't have, and instead, I correctly translated them as to insults. The main reason for that is that this boy was intentionally saying these things in order to make me feel uncomfortable. Whenever he called me whatever he felt like, I, as a straight guy, would feel super uncomfortable being told that I'm a cute by another guy. And to make me feel more embarrassed, he often said these things around his friends or in crowded areas to everyone so everyone could hear, and then they would all laugh at me. Additionally, whenever I told him to stop, he would continue doing it and make it worse insults, sometimes even going as far as making unwanted sexual comments about me, such as talking about wanting to make sexual advances to me. So it's safe to say that this is a clear case of sexual harassment. I didn't know what it was at the time, which definitely made the situation tougher since I didn't know how to approach it. So therefore, I decided to talk to an adult. That adult in mind was my youth pastor, and thankfully, he seemed to understand the situation very well and help me through it, telling me that he'll talk to that kid and let him know that what he's doing is immoral, unchristian-like, and even illegal. So that's what he did. Sometime later that week, my youth pastor met up with that kid and told him the issue and to stop. Thankfully, that kid gave in and stopped after the discussion and never spoke another word to me again. I'm glad my youth pastor was able to talk to some sense to him, since what he was doing was just downright unacceptable, no matter how old or what sexuality he was. By the way, I think that him being gay could have had an impact, as he likely might not have known how to approach his feelings for other guys, given that he's been told all gay people go to hell all his life. Nonetheless, even if he was struggling with his sexuality, he still should have known not to make unwanted sexual comments towards anyone, as that's never acceptable under any circumstances. But even if the situation was resolved, it still negatively affected my relationship with those in my grade long-term wise. Seeing that if they were willing to do stuff like this made me hate them more and more if future winter retreat weren't enough to make me hate their guts. All this anger and frustration would lead to me leaving myself out of everything and hating my church more and more, which I'll get to in part 6. So, that pretty much wraps up February. Let's move on to March. March 2019 was an interesting month, since it somewhat followed a similar pattern as March 2018, where the first half of the month was absolutely god-awful since I was living the 2 worst days of my entire life, and then the second half was absolutely amazing since that was the beginning of the post-depression period part 1. March 2019 would follow a similar pattern where the first half of the month sucked, but the second half was absolutely amazing. In fact, I would experience 2 incredible days in this month, both of which I consider to be in the amazing tier of the best days of my life. I'll go ahead and talk about one of those amazing days now, and then I'll talk about the other one a little later. So the first of the amazing tier days I want to talk about is Friday, March 8th, 2019. As mentioned earlier, this was a special day because it marked 1 year since I attempted suicide, as well as 1 year of me officially being self-harm free, so I was already expecting it to be a good day since it marked 1 year of a ton of growth and development, as well as giving me the chance to reflect on everything that happened over the course of the year and see just how far I had grown since that dreadful day. In addition, my parents also wanted to celebrate with me, since they of course were happy to see me still here and not in a situation as bad as that one anymore. So that morning, when I woke up, they made breakfast for me. Scrambled eggs, bacon, and jelly biscuits. After eating, Dad handed me a $20 bill to get snacks from the vending machine at school. So on the college side of my school, there was an area where all the vending machines were. Our school thankfully wasn't one of those that try to prohibit students from using the vending machine, since these obviously help the college generate money, since this is the college who funded our school. That meant that this money trickled down to the school. So at least our school had some economic sense with the machines, unlike other schools that I hear about banning these things. I'll talk about the vending machines in a little bit, since this would also allow me to make a realization about business and also make the class more interesting. For now, let's discuss crew. So my English teacher was out that day, therefore, for crew, we simply resorted to my algebra teacher's room. Dylan happened to be in this crew, so we spent our time talking about messing around, as well as me reflecting on everything that happened the year before since I already told Dylan about everything. Afterwards, it was time for college courses, so we all got lined up and went to our respective class. Of course, since it was Friday, that meant I went to business, but before that, I decided to stop by the vending machines and get a few snacks and drinks since Dad provided me with the money that morning. So I bought some stuff and went to class. Additionally, I bought extras to Sheriff Isaac, who was more than pleased to receive some free snacks. However, that's when I began to notice something. Unlike previous classes where I became bored very easily, I was quite engaged with the lecture and didn't see myself zoning out since I had sugar and caffeine to keep me focused. Then midway through the class, our professor stopped in lecturing and provided us time to work on our midterm. So our midterm was basically a take-home assignment that involved us answering questions in essay format. I'll talk more about it in a little bit. But anyways, me and Isaac were doing ours and simply enjoying our snacks. Our professor did talk to us a little bit since we were of course sat right in front of his desk and asked if we were having a feast, to which all three of us began laughing. But other than that, nothing else really happened during this class. However, I did realize that in order to make business fun, I needed to start taking snacks, so that's what kept me engaged throughout the class. So from then on, I would begin taking snacks with me to business, ultimately making the class more enjoyable. Then afterwards, we were dismissed and went to lunch. Lunch was the usual, nothing too big happened then. Then afterwards, it was time for classes. Nothing else really all that spectacular happened outside of my English teacher being absent, so English that day was just basically a study hall. Once the day was done, we were of course dismissed. My grandmother directly picked me up from school that day since Zoe was with mom doing something, so I was immediately taken home after school. Once I got home, I pretty much went straight to my bed and relaxed a little bit. I just thought about everything and also thought about what all happened the year prior. This day was a big milestone for me since alongside being the anniversary of my failed suicide attempt, it also marked me being 1 year self-harm free. An entire year without stabbing myself. God, it felt nice. And it feels even better now over 5 years of being self-harm free, since I'm no longer in that position that I was now and now in a better spot. Then later that night, the whole family got home and we decided to call in a pizza to celebrate. So Dad called up a pizza and we both went over to get it. While on the way over there, we mostly just talked about what all happened a year prior and how much I've grown. Then once we got back home, we all then had a nice little celebratory dinner. I had a few slices and everyone else did the same. And with that, March 8th, 2019 had come to an end. While not necessarily a good day because of what happened on this day, it was still a great day because of what it represented. 1 year of being alive and self-harm free was a big deal for me, especially after all the bullshit I endured the year before. It was just so relieving and felt absolutely amazing to say that it had been an entire year since I conquered the toughest challenge of my life. So that's why this was such a good day and why it falls under the amazing tier of my best days. In fact, pretty much every March 8th has been this way since. While I haven't celebrated as much on the anniversary, they've still always been good days to reflect over and examine just how much I've grown and developed since that god-awful day. This year's March 8th was especially special, as not only did it mark 5 years since the incident, but I also published my book on that day, a book directly based on the events of what led up to that day and the day itself. So needless to say, this will always be a special day, and although it marks the worst thing I had ever did in my life, it also marks growth and development as it allows me to celebrate an extra year without harming myself. Now, unfortunately, while that day would be great, that weekend would be pretty bad. This weekend was when the height of mine, Zoe's, and Mom's conflict with Dad in regards to swimming peaked, as on both Saturday and Sunday, we got in some heated arguments regarding swimming. So much yelling, name-calling, and just very tough conversations had between us that really started to make me feel hopeless. Not as hopeless as I felt the year prior, but still very hopeless knowing I would have to continue doing this godforsaken sport with a shithead coach who cared about nothing other than the sport. I prayed hard for a miracle to happen, and thankfully, a miracle would occur just 2 weeks later, which I'll get to later. For now, let's pause discussing this conflict and talk about academics. So let's start with English. So pretty much this would be around the time when our fighting stopped. It was around this time when I was starting to get my work done and not doing anything dumb in our class. So we stopped arguing that much. We weren't on good terms just yet, but we weren't on bad terms either. We would reach good terms pretty soon, which I'll get to later in the month. But for now, we were doing well. As for what we were doing in class, well, we began reading Romeo and Juliet, another required read for 9th grade. Of course, everyone has heard of arguably Shakespeare's most well-known play, so I won't need to go into detail about it here. But pretty much we read the whole play this month, and in April, we would do a project regarding it that I'll get to then. But during March, we read the play. At first, I was super scared about reading it since like the other works by Shakespeare and other Enlightenment era writers, this piece had a bunch of these and thous as well as written not in the way that we speak and write in today's world. However, our teacher found a translated version online that pretty much translates the play from Middle English to the modern day English we speak today. So I of course used this instead, and this made reading the play far easier since I could actually understand what was going on. Well, minus all the symbolism and inference bullshit English teachers do, but I at least was able to read the play just like a normal person. Moving on from that, let's discuss college classes. So let's start with business and talk about that midterm exam I mentioned just a little bit ago. So as stated, this is a take-home exam that was more like an assignment. For it, we were provided with 10 questions that had to be responded in an essay format, so 2 of 3 paragraphs per question. However, we were only required to answer 5 questions, meaning each question was worth 20 points. But if we answered a 6th question, our professor would give us up to 20 extra points on it, so the highest grade we could get on this exam was 120. Anyways, this is a really fun, really easy exam since, of course, it was an essay-based exam and not a multiple choice or a short answer exam. So I could actually think about each question and give a good response. So that's what I did for the 6 questions I attempted. I gave a thoughtful and well-written response to each question, and overall, I think I did great on it. Even reading over the midterm, I have to give it to 14-year-old me since this was a genuinely good paper in which I answered each question very well. My professor agreed and gave me 111 on the exam, so it's safe to say that I did pretty well on it. The best part is that the final would be in the same format, meaning the final would be easy as well. Also in business, we did our first 3 projects for this class. Our first project was a budgeting paper. We pretty much just had to interview someone we knew who managed a budget and ask them about how they manage it and what they take into consideration. I ended up just using the last minute when mom and dad were asleep, so I instead just fabricated an interview with dad since I knew he managed budgets and knew how. So I did that and my professor didn't see anything suspicious, so he gave me a 100 on it. Now let's move on to communications. So during this month, we did task 2, which was an exam. This is the only exam we had in the class, but at least after it, we wouldn't have another exam. So me and everyone else took it on the test day, and it was actually a pretty easy exam. Just 40 questions about basic stuff, and thanks to that, I made a 94 on it. So it went well at least. We also did an assignment for this class that I had a really fun time doing. For it, we had to basically keep track of all the times we used crude language. So from things as simple as saying fuck to full-on cussing people out. We had to keep track of how many times throughout the week we used this type of language. At first, I was a little wary about this assignment since I was having to put bad words on assignments, but when our professor told us that she's doing the assignment with us and actually ended up having more entries than most of us, that made me feel a little better. Anyways, I had a lot of entries for this assignment. Interestingly, a lot of them revolved around church. So during Sunday school, I often texted my friends telling them how awful Sunday school was and how shitty my grade was shitty the people at my grade were at church. And let's just say that I called them some very funny and ridiculous insults. Additionally, I also had quite a few Geometry Dash reactions in the hallway with my friends, since we of course said every cuss word there is playing Geometry Dash. And I also had some choice words to say about my English teacher to my friends, since of course I was still not a big fan of hers. Overall, it was a really fun assignment to go through and also reflect on the whole conflict at church retrospectively. Especially seeing how my issue with those in my grade ended up going so far as to almost making me quit religion entirely. Thankfully that didn't happen since I'm now happier as a Methodist than I was as a Baptist, but it's still interesting to think about it. My professor also agreed, as she gave me a 100 for not only doing well on the assignment, but also being one of the few students who surpassed her, as she had a ton of bad language entries when she did hers, so I even beat her on it. So now let's discuss film. So this month, we did a 2-part assignment that corresponded with our semester project. This assignment dealt with citing sources and using APA format, since our semester project had to be written in that format and required sources. So for the first assignment, we had to go to the library and ask the librarian about APA format. Right off the bat, this is a dumb assignment. For one, all of us knew how to use APA format since our community health paper had to be written in that format. And even though our professor didn't know that, he still should have expected us to have already know how to write in APA format, given that this was a college course. Sure, a little reminder and some resources would have been nice to have, but he really should have expected that we already knew how to use APA format better than what he anticipated. But the real issue was actually going to the library and asking the librarian about using it. This was pretty much a complete waste of time on our part because, well, we know how to use it already, so we weren't really learning anything, just going over to hear stuff we already knew. But that's not even the real issue about that. The real issue is actually going to the library. Remember that rule I mentioned back in August that said we had to be 16 in order to walk around our campus on our own? Well, that's the issue that happened here. None of us were 16 yet, and even though our school were massive hypocrites regarding it, which I'll get to more in part 6, they did not let us walk around campus while an adult. Therefore, to do this assignment, we either had to get our parents to take us over to the library or completely make something up on the assignment. And of course, being 14-year-old me, I did the latter of the two. Dylan actually went to the library and asked the librarian the questions and stuff, so I asked him what he talked to, who he talked to, and if there was anything significant that came out of the interview. He told me the name of the librarian and pretty much said that everything she said was all the basic stuff. So I copied down the name of the librarian and then wrote everything else since I knew what APA format was. My professor didn't check to see if we actually went to the library or not, so he gave me 100 for this assignment. Now, the second part involved actually applying what we learned from the first part, or in my case what I already knew, and finding some credible sources for our semester project. With our sources, we had to create an annotated bibliography. An annotated bibliography is pretty much like a normal bibliography, but with a short paragraph explaining the source, what else all included it, and why the source is credible. Our professor required an annotated bibliography on the semester project, so this assignment was more to help us prepare for it. Now, let's just say that the entire time of doing this assignment was absolutely agonizing. Having to manually read through sources and summarize them was not fun at all, especially since I had not even watched my film yet. So this is quite a torturous process, but I got through it and submitted it, only to make a 70 on it. I don't remember what my professor didn't like about my annotations, but I didn't care. I was just done with the assignment and ready to move on. So, that's all that happened regarding academics this month. Let's now go back to swimming. So firstly, I want to discuss Monday, March 18th. At first glance, this might seem like a typical practice at the 25-yard pool. However, it would go on to be one of the most important practices ever, as it would be my very last practice for over 2 years. Now, the practice itself was rough. However, I did get to have a take fat moment to my coach. So around the middle of practice, we were doing a set of 8 50s of catch-up drill, which is a drill used to work on freestyle pools. It was actually the first drill I ever learned when I began swimming. Anyways, on the third 50, my coach noticed I was not doing the drill correctly. Even though he knew I was completely unmotivated to swim, hence me not doing meets anymore, he was still trying to push me to get faster and better for whatever reason. So he pulled me to the side on this 50 and told me what I was doing wrong and how to correct it. However, I pretty much forgot about the correction and kept doing the drill as I normally did. So on the 450, he pulled me to the side again and told me what I was doing wrong. That's when an idea popped in my mind. Since he was being an ass more old to me, why not be one back at him? It wasn't like I was trying to get better, since I could care less about swimming better. So I decided that for the 5th 50, I was going to swim the way I normally did on purpose, so I did that. My coach then came over and pulled me to the side once more, but this time, he was frustrated with which is what I wanted. That's when he said, "Do you even want to get better?" Without answering his question, I went into the water and started doing my next 50 in the set. I could hear him scream my name and order me back, but I ignored him and just kept swimming with a big fat smile on my face. Seeing this asshole angry made me happy, especially after all the shit he had put me through since September of 2017. Sure, you could claim that I was being a dick to him here, claiming that he was just trying to make me better swimmer and I should have listened to him, but remember, I didn't care about getting better, and he knew that. I stopped doing meets 4 months earlier, and I had no motivation to get better. But despite knowing that, my coach still insisted that swimming was the only way and that I needed to do better. So looking back on it, I don't see any issue with what I did, since my coach did much worse. He didn't say anything to me for the rest of the practice, so I just continued going through the rest of practice like normal. But that wasn't the only great thing about this practice. The other great thing about this practice was that it would also be, of course, my last practice. For the rest of the week, we didn't go to practice. So then that brings me to Saturday, March 23rd, 2019. A day that falls on the amazing tier of the best days of my life, so let's get to it. So, that morning, I was put in a pretty good mood when Dad said that we were going out to eat for lunch. We went to a local restaurant that has really good burgers and fries, so I of course got that. We also ate on the patio, as this restaurant has a patio with a ring toss game on it, so we spent a lot of time playing it. Eventually, our food came and then we started eating. However, soon afterwards, Dad would make an announcement that would be the reason why this was such an amazing day. He announced that after talking to Mom some more, he was going to let me and Zoe quit swimming, effective immediately. Immediately, me and Zoe both became excited knowing we were finally done with our coach's bullshit and that godforsaken sport. Mom too was super happy, and even Dad cracked a smile seeing us all excited. He then revealed that this was the occasion for us going out to eat, to celebrate us quitting the team. Needless to say, this is a great way to celebrate us finally leaving the team and wrapping up a very critical part of my life. Now, even though he was giving in, Dad was still kind of sour about us quitting the team, but he would let it happen and eventually consider it to be a good thing when me and Zoe started making higher grades and being happier as a result of quitting. In addition to when he discovered the truth about our coach when I wrote and recorded Storytime 8 2 years later. And even then, this wasn't a permanent leave from the swimming, as I'd actually returned to it 2 years later. In fact, I even swim today, often timing myself in events I thought I'd never swim, like the 500 freestyle, 400 IM, and the 200 butterfly, which I definitely am not doing again for a long time. But I'll talk more about my return to swimming in part 8. Now, March 23rd was also a very significant day because it's the day that I consider to be the start of post-depression period part 2. In part 4, as well as in the beginning of the story time, I talked about post-depression period part 1, which consisted of the 8 months after I was cured of depression. Even though the intermission period ended that period, I consider it to be more of a pause than an actual end to a good period. Once I finally quit swimming as well as stopped arguing with my English teacher, the post-depression period started back up again, with it of course being the second part. This part would last much longer than post-depression period part 1, lasting from March 23rd, 2019 all the way to March 15th, 2020, right when the COVID-19 pandemic began, almost an entire year. Just like how the first one made 2018 a great year despite all that happened in the first quarter, this period would do the same to 2019, making 2019 the best year of my life. Now, later that night, Mom emailed our coach letting him know that me and Zoe were quitting. She stayed professional with the email, so not calling our coach out or anything. She simply said that after almost 3 years of swimming, me and Zoe were tired of it and ready to move on. She didn't thank Tim for giving us the opportunity to swim under him, and then ended the email. However, if all the stuff that I've talked about with my coach wasn't enough, he did not even respond to the email. Yeah, he was that butthurt about losing 2 swimmers that he didn't even respond to Mom's email. If I was the coach, I would have probably responded with, "Thank you for letting me know. While I'm sad to see the 2 go, I wish for the best of luck in their future endeavors and I hope they have fun in whatever they choose to do next." Not ignore the damn email. However, me and Zoe's quitting of the team would prove to be quite monumental for the team. You see, everyone knew me and Zoe were demotivated to swim and didn't care about it anymore. That's why the boys from the relay team from earlier didn't mind when I quote-unquote let them down, since they knew I didn't want to swim anymore. Therefore, after seeing us 2 quit, both of us practically became being veterans on the team. Many others would begin quitting the team over the next couple years. In fact, membership declined by 50% in 2019. Many prominent swimmers on the team, including Alex and all the boys from the relay team, quit the team later in the year. A lot of other upper-level swimmers also quit. It would get so bad that our coach ended up getting fired in early 2021 for all the bullshit he imposed on us. So needless to say, I and the rest of the team had the last laugh. Now, as for transportation, starting the following week at school, our grandmother would begin directly picking me and Zoe up from our respective schools and taking us straight home. Since I also had very little homework during this time, this pretty much meant that I had all the free time in the world, and man did it feel nice. Being able to relax after school and move on to my own thing just felt amazing, and I personally think that's how school should operate for everyone, as homework really is a pain in the ass. But getting home, pulling up YouTube on the TV, and sitting on my recliner felt so nice, especially since I didn't have to worry about swimming or really anything at this point. So with that, let's wrap up March by going back to English. First, let's talk about the last intensive for the school year. Well, it wasn't necessarily an intensive, as we didn't do anything for seminar or really do anything for it, but we did write one of those intensive papers for English, so we'll call it a sort of intensive. For this paper, we had to write about a memory. Could be either a good or a bad memory, but it had to be about a memory we vividly remember, and one that of course really stuck with us. I had quite a lot of memories that I could talk about. You of course had really bad memories such as March 7th and 8th, 2018, getting left out at Fuge, getting left out at Winter Retreat, and so many more. But there's also a lot of good ones like June 7th, 2016, rock climbing at the beginning of the school year, and the very recent quitting swim. Ultimately, however, I decided to write about a good memory. That memory in question, June 23rd, 2018, aka the day I got home from Fuge, as well as that supernatural tier day I discussed earlier. Looking back on it, I think this was the perfect day to talk about, since it was truly an amazing day that I literally consider to be the best day of the best summer of my life. So, that's what I did. I wrote about getting back from Fuge after suffering almost a week up there, seeing all my presents on my bed, and having a nice dinner by the pool. I used as much imagery as I could in this essay to represent just how great of a day it was, and I did it very beautifully. In fact, this paper would go on to be the reason why I can remember this day so well and why I enjoy looking back on it. So needless to say, this is a very well written paper that I consider to be my best paper from freshman year. My teacher agreed and gave me 100 for it. Speaking of my teacher, let's wrap up March by talking about her son. So near the end of the month, I realized that I was quite far behind, as I only had a 77 in our class for the 4th quarter. So therefore, one day, I decided to ask my teacher what I could do to race at 77, and the look on her face just screamed shock. Out of all people, I asked her how to improve my grade, since that was not something she expected. So she told me about an upcoming project that we were doing to do with Romeo and Juliet, where it would be a class discussion that basically would be the easiest project of the whole year. She would then told me some tips and tricks for it, and also thanked me for asking her about improving my grade. I then thanked her and went back to sit down with a smile on my face. It finally happened. The same teacher whom I've had beat with all year now had a lot of respect for me. However, still didn't respect her too much, but that attitude would change in April when she would do something that shocked me just as much as I shocked her that day. So with that, let's move on to April. April 2019 was a kick-ass month. A lot of great stuff happened and was just a great month to live through, given that this was post-depression period part 2. To start, since I just talked about English, let's start with it. So this would be the month we did that Romeo and Juliet project. For it, we had nights at the round table discussion. So for it, we moved the desk to be in a circle. Prior to the discussion, we were given a packet with all the questions we were going to get over. So I and everyone else wrote our answers to the questions on our packets so that for discussion, we'd have them on hand. Now, this discussion was videoed by the technology guy. This time, he was able to record the video, and thanks to him, I have a whole video discussion. Now, in order to make an A on this project, all we had to do was speak at least 4 times. These had to be actual responses and comments, not I agree or something. Well, saying we agree was fine, but we had to say why. Since I already knew the tips from my teacher, I was able to go in and do really well. Despite being more of an introvert, I spoke up quite a bit in this discussion, answering multiple questions and responding to many of my classmates. In fact, I was speaking up so much that my teacher had to pass a note telling me to not speak anymore so that other students could talk. So needless to say, I did super well on this project, and thanks to me speaking up, I made 100 on it and only reinforced my teacher that I truly had changed. So, that's what happened with this project. Ultimately, because of my fantastic performance with it, I would see a massive shocker for myself during SLCs. So this month, more specifically April 11th, we did our spring SLC. So SLC 2 out of 3 for me. Unlike the previous SLC, we did not have any project to present to our parents. So it was simply just us individually signing up for a time and showing our parents our binder. So me and mom signed up for the 4 o'clock and did our SLC. Nothing really too memorable happened while I showed mom my SLC binder. However, as we were exiting the school, my English teacher approached us. She introduced herself to mom, and then right there and there, she started going off about how wonderful a student I was and how great I was. Immediately, I became shocked as my teacher continued going off about my performance during the Romeo and Juliet discussion, as well as just about my work ethic in general. Mom was thoroughly impressed too, going on about how much my teacher bragged about me as we were walking onto our van. I too was super happy to hear that the teacher I had issues with throughout the school year had done something as sweet as this. This would be the moment I began to respect my teacher and would be when our relationship turned from one-sided to really good. This teacher would ultimately make a huge impact on my life, as she would of course be the one who challenged me to write and publish a book, which I did 4 years later in March of 2023. So needless to say, the fixing of our relationship was huge, especially for my development and accomplishments. So with that said, let's talk about my college courses. So in communications, we did our 3rd task. For it, we had to do a film review. As someone who was also taking film at the same time, I was quite happy to see that we were doing this, since I could simply apply what I was learning in film and apply it here. As for what the film review was on, it was on the movie Homeless to Harvard. I remember almost nothing about this movie, so I can't really comment on it, but I can comment on the film review. So we watched the movie during 2 classes, and then we had to write a 2-page review on the movie. But more specifically, we had to focus on interpersonal communications used throughout the movie and how those impacted the characters. So I did that, and in a very short amount of time, I finished, submitted it, and received a 97 for it. So pretty easy assignment nonetheless. Staying on the topic of film reviews, let's talk about film. So this would be the month where I did my semester project. As mentioned, it had to be a long paper about an assigned movie that goes into great detail about all the different stuff in the movie. So during spring break, I finally got to watching Titanic with Zoe, who also wanted to see it. Overall, it was a really good movie that definitely lived up to its hype. Zoe cried a bit while watching it, but I was unfazed since I was paying attention more to the cinematography, lights, plot, and all that other stuff bullshit film critics do that ruin movies for me. Afterwards, I got to writing. It didn't take as long as I anticipated, only taking a few hours, unlike the 3 months our professor said it would take. Then once I finished, boy was I satisfied as hell. 11 pages, over 3,000 words long, and I was finally done. This was by far the longest thing I had ever written up to that point, and it would maintain its position as the longest thing I ever wrote prior to Storytime. But once I submitted it, I was so happy to have this thing off my chance. And the best part is that I did well on it, getting an 83 on it. This was actually the highest grade I had received on a film review, so I was very satisfied to receive the grade on this project since it was worth 30% of my grade. Now let's talk a little bit about health. So this is a strange month for health because, well, it was sex ed time. For it, we had to get a permission from my parents. My parents didn't care, so I got them to sign a slip and I was able to take it. Everyone else got their slip signed too. Anyways, unlike most people who might talk about how disgusting it was and how awkward this class was, I honestly don't remember too much about sex ed. Like, the only thing I remember us going over was using protection, how to use it, including one day when our professor passed around a condom, and the parts of a penis and the parts of a vagina. Stuff I've unfortunately never got to experience for myself since I've never had sex before, even at 19 years old. But maybe one day I'll get me some pussy. But at least that made the end of my Tuesday and Thursday a little more interesting for this month. Also, I should mention that me and everyone else was quite mature during sex ed, so we never really laughed at all that much or did anything awkward. So it was pretty much what a sex ed teacher's dream class would be. Although it's also why I don't really remember sex ed all that much. But at least it wasn't anywhere near as bad as most others' experience with it. Alright, so for the final class I have to discuss for the month, let's talk about business. So in business, we did another project for this month. However, I honestly remember very little about it. Like, I can remember that it was about budgeting and creating our own budget, but I remember so little about it that I can't comment on it too much other than the fact that I made a 96 on it. So that was that. And honestly, the rest of the month doesn't really have anything else. April 2019, while a very relaxing month since I was no longer swimming, was also not a very eventful month. I also did not attend D-Now 2019, so while everyone else migrated at church did it, I stayed at home since I of course promised myself that I would not attend another church trip. And then would probably be that would also be a good call on my part since I likely would have got fuged at this event too. So to wrap up April, let's talk about a pretty funny incident with my friend Edward. So one day it was raining, and by raining, I mean it was raining hard. So Edward decided that to assert his dominance over everyone, he was going to T-pose out in the rain for 30 minutes. And sure enough, he actually did it. This happened during lunch, and me and everyone else in the whole school was watching him assert his dominance as he stood there for a whole 30 minutes with his arms spread out. Eventually, he stopped and our English teacher provided him with a towel, but needless to say, Edward became quite well known at our school for that and would receive a lot of attention and respect, since that's what happens when you assert your dominance to a whole school in the middle of a rainstorm. So with all that discussed, let's move on to May. May 2019 was a really good and pretty big month that had quite a bit happen. It would also be the last month of school, as my high school let out a week before Memorial Day, unlike my elementary, intermediate, and middle schools that didn't let out until the second week of June. This is because our school started earlier during the beginning of August, so therefore, we got out earlier to compensate. So that's why I'll only be discussing up to the 21st for the story time, but I'll discuss the rest of this month in part 6. Anyways, a good place to start would be to talk about the 5th of the big 5 projects we did for Crew. Now, this one was a lot like the Amazing Crew Race, where it wasn't necessarily a project, but more of an event, just that this event lasted the entire second half of the day, rather than one class period. Anyways, this event was Earth Day. So every year on the first Friday of May, my school does an Earth Day where we spend the day taking care of nature. So from things like cleaning the outdoor classroom, to growing plants, to painting rocks, to picking up trash, we do stuff that not only helps the school, but also helps the college's campus and the environment as a whole. And of course we got out of class too, which was especially nice given that we were in that final exam review mode. So this is a pretty good day, even if I'm not one for being outdoors or doing yard work or anything like that. Now, this Earth Day in particular took place on Friday, May 3rd. This was actually the only Earth Day that I participated in, as COVID screwed up Earth Day for 2020 and 2021, and then I of course would graduate at the end of 2021, so this was the only year I participated in Earth Day. Anyways, the first half of the day was normal, as we went to Crew and then went to our college class, which in my case was business. Then once we were finished with our class, we had lunch and then reported back to Crew, so in my case, English. Now, we didn't stay in our Crew for too long, as once everyone arrived, our teacher individually told us where we were going to go. I was assigned to go with the 10th grade math teacher's classroom, so I went over to his room. I actually talked a little bit about him already back in part 4, since he happened to be the same middle school boys small group leader, or my middle school boys small group leader. So I went to his house every Monday and with the other middle school boys at our church back in 8th grade, so I already knew who he was. He'll be much more prevalent in part 6 for not only being my 10th grade seminar teacher, but also being the face of my school's biggest scandal of all time. Anyways, how Earth Day worked was that half of the school went to a local state park and hiked the mountain. We could choose to do this or stay put, since there were only a limited number of spots available. I chose to stay at school, so I did not hike any mountains. My English teacher went along with the hikers, so that meant that we couldn't stay together as a crew. So for me and everyone else who stayed at school, we were each assigned to a different crew, and the crew I was assigned to was the 10th grade math teacher, so he was our group leader. At first, I was a little scared since I was the only freshman in the group, but luckily for me, Hunter was also assigned here and so were a lot of his friends, so I was still part of the group despite being the only freshman. Anyways, what we did was that we rotated between 3 stations, which I'll talk about each one individually. We stayed at each station for an hour. For the first station, we raked leaves by the outdoor classroom. So I actually forgot to mention this back in part A, but back when we were doing the orienteering competition, Jackson lost his phone in the outdoor classroom, and me and the rest of the entire school spent 15 minutes looking for it. We eventually found it, and it was quite fun given that we as a school teamed up to search for it. Now, the reason it took so long for us to find the phone was because the outdoor classroom was filled to the brim with fallen leaves. Remember, the outdoor classroom was an area by the miniature forest to the north of our school, where there was huge trees that towered over the area as well as a little creek that flows right through. Therefore, for this station, we were going to clean up this area. So that's what we did. We were each provided with gloves and rakes, and we raked the area. Overall, we made huge progress on the outdoor classroom. Like, we were split into groups in order to rake specific areas, and the area that me, Hunter, and his friends raked looked almost unrecognizable when we finished when we started, which surprised me quite a bit since we spent like 3/4 of our time hitting each other with the rakes, but we still somehow got the job done, so that was that. And afterwards, we moved on to the second station, that being the garden. So my school grew a multitude of vegetables outside in its southern outdoor area. Me and my friends would often go out here and mess around during lunch whenever it wasn't too hot outside. This area also had a staircase, which is the same staircase that we tested our safety egg landing designs back from our first intensive. So alongside doing community service and celebrating Earth Day, I also got to take a nostalgic trip around campus to see some places I went to at the beginning of the school year. Anyways, what our job was out here was to pull weeds in order to make sure the vegetables had a healthy harvest. So that's what we did. However, these weeds were pretty large, often requiring a shovel to pull up. In fact, I remember at one point, me and my group leader both had to push down on the same shovel just to get one weed up. Yeah, these weeds were big, but we got them taken care of so the crops could have a healthier harvest. Additionally, just like our time raking leaves, we also played around quite a bit. In fact, at one point, our group leader and Hunter even started playing Star Wars with the shovels while the rest of us cheered them on. So not only did we work really hard, but we played really hard as well. Then a little while later, it was time for the last station of the day. This station was a little weird, as there were 2 parts to it. The first part involved us picking up trash on the roadside. So the city my school was in has a huge issue with littering. Like, people here just cannot seem to put something in the trash for the life of them. So they throw their trash outside in the grass in front of our school. Not only does this dirty our school, but it also harms the environment and wildlife that live within the grass, and they throw their trash in. So therefore, we spent the first 25 minutes of the station picking up trash. However, there wasn't a whole lot of trash to pick up. Since the other 2 groups had already been to the station, they picked up a good majority of the trash each, leaving us with not that much trash to pick up, so we didn't really do too much here other than mess around. Now, the second part is the one I remember the most, so it differed from the other stations by the fact that it actually took place inside. This was super ideal since after working hard outside, like, even though it was only in the mid to high 70s, we were still working very hard and sweating, so being able to go back inside in an air conditioning building felt super nice. Anyways, for this part of the station, we specifically went to the biology lab. We were then each given some paint, rocks, and a fruit or vegetable. That vegetable was what we had to paint. So we got to, vegetable or fruit is what we had to paint. So we got to paint rocks for this part of the station, which was actually a lot more enjoyable than you might expect. Not just because me, Hunter, and his friends were joking around, but painting something that isn't a sheet of paper or canvas was very interesting and not something many of us had done before. So that made the station more fun. Now, my assigned fruit was a pepper, which I should mention that up until I wrote this story time, I thought peppers were vegetables, but after doing some research, I learned that they are actually fruits, so you learn something every day. Anyways, you'll come to know that I am not the best artist. In fact, I am one of the worst, so therefore, you can expect how this went, although it didn't actually go as bad as I expected it to. I first painted the rock black, which made my paper stand out a lot more since it had a black background. The rocks we were given were sedimentary rocks, which usually consist of a whole bunch of grains and other materials inside the rocks that make them look chunky. Would have been easier if I was provided with obsidian or some other igneous rock, but painting the rock black was easy enough, so I can't complain. Then I got to painting the actual thing. So if you were thinking that my painting would ultimately look like a fuse between a penis and the Chili's logo, well, you'd be right, unfortunately. I am such a horrible artist that instead of drawing a pepper, I drew a red and green eggplant along that actually looks like the Chili's logo. Yeah, not exactly what I was aiming for when trying to draw a pepper. In fact, it looked so bad that I even had to paint the word pepper underneath so people would think that I painted a pepper and not some emoji that bots like to spam. My friends all, of course, gave me a hard time about it for the rest of the day, and we all joked about it. But considering I was trying to draw a pepper, nobody could say anything. In fact, the rock is still at my old high school today, even over 4 years later, so future generations of early college students will get to look at my masterpiece whenever they enter the biology lab. And with that, Earth Day was finished. The group that went hiking returned around this time, and then went up to wrap up the day. We did like we always did on Fridays by doing closing circle. This time outside by the garden so everyone could see our hard work. So that was a pretty nice way of getting out of the classroom and taking our minds off exams, since those were of course coming up and since it would be the end of the school year. But before I get to exams, let's wrap up academics for not only May, but for the entire school year. Once I finish discussing my last assignments for each course, we'll move on to finals. None of my high school courses had anything interesting happen for pre-finals, so we'll jump straight to college courses and talk about wrapping those up. To start, let's discuss something very sinister that happened in health. So on the night after the second to last day of class, some dumbass decided to steal half of the class's quiz sheets. These were the sheets we did our check-in quizzes on, and what our grades were determined by. Mine happened to be included in that batch that was stolen. How this thief managed to get into the classroom, who that thief was, and why they decided to steal half of the quiz papers is still a mystery that would never be solved. Therefore, on the last day of class, our professor asked me and the others whose quiz was stolen to see him after class. So we met with him once everyone left, and he told us what happened. However, after explaining the situation, he proposed a deal. He would give us each a 100 in the class as long as we didn't tell the others. Of course, all of us agreed, so all of us were provided with 100s for health, and none of us told anyone else about the incident until sophomore year. So therefore, I made a 100 in this class just because some dumbass stole my quiz sheet. Probably the best 100 I've ever received. And with that, health was finished. Let's talk about the end of another class, that being film. So for our last assignment, we basically had to write a blog post about how the things we learned in the class could apply to other forms of media like songs, books, video games, etc. I wrote a pretty good article about how I could see some stuff from film criticism being applied to video game criticism, using Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire's infamous 7.8 out of 10 Too Much Water IGN review as an example. My professor seemed to really like this blog and like my stance on it, so he gave me a 100 for my last assignment in film, giving me an 86 in the class. I probably could have made an A in this class had my film reviews been much better, as well as done a few tweaks on my semester project, but overall, I was satisfied with the grade for this class. Now let's wrap up the third college class I want to wrap up, being communications. So to finish it, we did our final task, that being a speech. So for it, we pretty much had to do a speech as if we were winning a huge reward or finishing something that involves giving a speech. So what did I do? I decided to pretend like I was a rapper winning a Grammy. And oh god, this was a god-awful speech that I absolutely hate looking back on. Like, this was genuinely my cringiest moment as a freshman. But even though I hate talking about all the embarrassing shit I did as a teen, I know y'all absolutely love it. So to make y'all satisfied, I'll tell y'all what happened. Anyways, I'll just go ahead and say up front that the main reason this was such cringy and awful speech was that I added humor to a speech that shouldn't have had any. You see, my speech was actually about my story of overcoming depression and anxiety that I told in part 4. Obviously, if you saw that story time or literally have been paying any bit of attention to the story time, you know this is a very serious situation since it resulted in me developing a self-harm addiction and attempting suicide. However, I did this story very dirty with the story time. This all had to do with my rap handle and me cracking jokes during the speech. So I decided that my rap name should be Bees! Additionally, I decided to start my speech with the first few lines from the Bee movie. According to all known laws of aviation, there is no way a bee should be able to fly. Its wings are too small to get its fat little body off the ground. The bee, of course, flies anyways because bees don't care what humans think is impossible. Now, even though the Bee movie is a masterpiece and is a ridiculously hilarious show, making jokes about it here was not the best idea. Additionally, I also thought it would be a good idea to wear bee antennas, and I shit you not, these antennas, along with my glasses, genuinely made me look like Adam. Not the best appearance when discussing a pretty serious matter. And the speech itself was bad too. I stuttered quite a bit and I came rather unprepared. I cracked horrible puns, and I even called someone a bitch in the speech. Even though my professor was fine with it, I still probably should have refrained from using bad words in the speech, especially since this was the Grammys, not a music video or a concert. However, my professor actually liked the speech, as she gave me a 96 for it. Additionally, the rest of the class enjoyed it, given by how much they laughed and joked around with me about it. But overall, I really don't like looking back on this moment since it was definitely not my best performance. I did at least make a 96 in the class itself, so I still keep my A and enjoyed the class as well. And finally, to wrap up college courses for both the spring 2019 semester as well as my freshman year of high school, let's discuss business. So I have 2 projects and a final to discuss for this class. Let's start with the first project. So for it, we were introduced to it way back in February. Here, our professor introduced us to a website called Wall Street Survivor, which was like a virtual stock market website where you could practice investment decisions and stock purchases. He wanted us to practice with it for the semester and have us write a 1-page paper about our experience with the game. Easy enough, right? Well, would be if I actually played the game. You see, I pretty much completely forgot about the website until a few days before the assignment was due. However, like anything else I did in the class, I decided to just fabricate my experience. And this was much easier than expected, as I understood how the game worked. So I picked 3 stocks at random, looked at their growth for a single day, and used that day as a sample for the entire 3 months. And it worked, as my professor gave me a 100 for the project. Even though this did mean that I missed out on gaining valuable investment experience, I've since learned how the stock market works as a business student, as well as how to use statistics to predict stock growth and make good investment decisions, which is what really interested me in the stock market and investing, since I really love statistics. Now, the other project we did as a group was a group project. It was a marketing project. For it, we had to come up with a product and then provide a marketing plan for it. This is a very common project for marketing classes, as I ended up doing a more detailed project for my community college marketing class that I'll discuss in part 8, as well as one for my university marketing class this past summer. However, this one was nowhere near as detailed as those. For it, all we had to do was come up with a product that solves an issue, create a PowerPoint outlining the issue, and then tell the class why we think our product would do well. So my group decided to advertise a product that basically would be a USB stick where if you plugged it into the computer, it would provide Wi-Fi to that computer. This is to help solve the issue of students who do not have internet at home. So we talked about its design and purpose in front of the class, and even though our professor was quite confused of the whole time we presented, since we didn't put too much thinking into it, he still liked our idea and thought we had a good outline, so he gave us a 95 for it. Now, the last thing I'll have to discuss for business before I finally have it wrapped up is the final. So the final for this class was in the same format as our midterm, where we were provided with a list of questions and had to answer a select amount of the questions in essay format. However, there was no extra credit offered for answering additional questions, meaning the highest grade we could receive on this final was 100 and not 120 like our midterm. So one night, I sat down and did the whole thing since it was easy, and then pressed submit, allowing me to be done with this class. I ultimately made a 94 on the final, giving me a 96 as my final grade for this course. So now that college courses are done, let's wrap up the school year by discussing finals. So unlike college finals, where I had virtually none since the business final was barely a final to begin with, high school finals were standardized tests. Back in December, I discussed taking the geometry NCFE, so we'll stick to the topic of NCFEs by discussing the NCFE for English. So we took this final on Wednesday, May 8th. All of us freshmen were gathered into the multipurpose room, where our teacher read off her script and then we took our test. This test went about as well as an NCFE could go. I got very interesting, relatable, and enjoyable passages, including one about swimming, ironically enough. I can't disclose what the passages were since that's illegal under North Carolina state law, but I can mention that they were pretty good passages, and my grade showed, as I made a 94 on it. NCFEs counted 20% of our grade. So this pushed my grade in English up so that my final grade in the class was an 88. Almost an A, and had I not had the issues I had with my teacher earlier in the year, I probably could have made an A. Now, other than getting good passages, actually taking the exam itself isn't really the most memorable part about it. There's 2 things about it that were really memorable. The first one is what happened immediately after the exam. So after a teacher says, "You have completed your exam," everyone is usually silent until the teacher provides more instructions. However, that wasn't the case with this exam. After our English teacher said, "Congratulations, you have now completed the North Carolina Grade 9 English final exam," me and everyone else started cheering and clapping. This class screwed up everyone, since a lot of people also had the same issues with the teacher. So we were all happy to have finally wrapped up the class. Our teacher and principal, who was actually in the room supervising us, also joined us in the applause too, so everyone was happy. As for the other memorable thing about this exam, it was also the only NCFE I took in high school. Being part of the class of 2022, or December 2021 if you want to be more specific, I went to high school during a super weird time. The COVID-19 pandemic started roughly 75% of the way through my sophomore year. This pandemic made it so that standardized tests could not be administered, so in 2020, all standardized tests in North Carolina were canceled, including EOGs, EOCs, and NCFEs. This got me out of 2 EOCs that I'll touch on at the end of part 6. However, while the state decided to start back EOGs and EOCs in 2021 when things calmed down, they decided to permanently discontinue NCFEs, getting me out of a total of 6 NCFEs total. If you include the EOCs that I got out of, that's 8 standardized tests I got out of thanks to coronavirus. I still did the ACT and SAT, but they weren't even required since most colleges were test-free during this time. So I got out of a ton of exams and therefore a ton of stress. I'll go more into detail about just how stress-free I was during coronavirus in part 7, and how it led to me making the highest grades I had ever received throughout my time in school. Staying on the topic of standardized tests, let's talk about the last final I have to discuss for the story time, that being the Algebra 2 EOC, which I took on Friday, May 17th. This was an interesting exam, as not only was it an EOC and not an NCFE like our geometry exam, but it was also the first time the state ever administered an EOC for this class. In fact, my school was the very first school in the entire state to take this exam just because of how our schedule worked. I'll talk more about why that's important and to know in a little bit. Now, EOCs differ from NCFEs because rather than including 40 questions, they include 75. In return, we're also provided 3 hours to take them and an additional hour if needed, unlike NCFEs which are done in 2 hours. Additionally, roughly 10% of the questions on EOCs are field questions, which are questions that are not counted towards your score, but are used to help the state conduct studies and determine what types of questions they should add or get rid of in future exams. So you can kind of think of EOCs as being a little more serious than NCFEs. Although just like NCFEs, they counted for 20% of our grade, so really it was just a matter of more questions and being scarier. Now, the format for this exam worked practically the same as the geometry final did back in December. Me and my class took the exam in the multi-purpose room alongside the sophomores. Additionally, that student who asked if we needed to put our calculators in degrees mode also asked the same question for this exam, to which our professor responded with the same response he gave back in December, and we all also laughed. Unfortunately, though, this was not nearly as helpful of a question for this exam as it was during the geometry final, since we actually used Radian mode for some questions on this exam, but still funny, a little callback nonetheless. And then we got started. Overall, the exam wasn't too difficult. There were quite a few weirdly worded questions, but the exam wasn't anything too difficult. Then, ironically, right as the exam time was finished, I finished the exam myself, meaning I didn't have to wait around at all for us to be dismissed. And with that, I was officially done with not just exams for the school year, but all of academics entirely for freshman year. But before I get ahead of myself, let's discuss the results of this exam. So this would go on to be probably the weirdest exam I ever took throughout my time at school. So the following Monday, May 20th, our algebra teacher gathered all of us who took the exam into his classroom, where he revealed to us a secret about the exam. The secret? This exam would have no effect on our grade. The reason is because, as mentioned, this was the first time the state ever administered an EOC for Algebra 2, so they decided that they were going to use our scores for testing and research purposes, only instead of for scoring purposes. Therefore, instead of only 10% of our questions being field questions, 100% of our questions on the exam were field questions. Half of the class was happy to hear the news while the other half was upset. I personally was happy since I had a 91 in the class, so I got to maintain it and keep an A in the class. Our teacher then told us that he couldn't tell us prior to the exam, since if he did, the results would be very biased since we wouldn't try our hardest, but at least it didn't count towards our grade. And because of this unique case, I consider this to be an illegitimate EOC, meaning the only real EOC I ever took in school was the Algebra 1 EOC that I took back in 8th grade, meaning I went the entirety of high school without taking a legitimate EOC. Additionally, that also meant that the only 2 legitimate standardized tests I took in high school, excluding the ACT and the SAT, were the Geometry and English 1 NCFEs, also meaning that last school year I took state exams in was 9th grade. Really weird to think of it that way, but hey, I happened to go to high school at the perfect time, so this ended up being the case for me. And with that, we found ourselves at the last week of school. This is a super short week, only going up to Tuesday, May 21st. To start, that Monday, May 20th, wasn't anything too memorable. We spent the first half of our day in the first block, so in my case, that would have been English, where we basically just watched a movie like how most of the end-of-year activities go. Then after lunch, the 10th grade teachers took us and did a little intensive with us. This intensive was more of an introduce us to 10th grade, allow us to get to know them, and set us up for our first intensive of sophomore year, which I'll of course touch on in part 6 since it would actually be the main highlight of that school year, even surpassing COVID-19. I'm not going to spoil it here, since even if I discussed that intensive like a billion times in Storytime 5 when I did my first sophomore year Storytime, but I'll just go ahead and mention that the question that sophomore year was assigned was, how do I make good choices? So we did quite a few things regarding choices and how to make good ones. And with that, we have finally reached Tuesday, May 21st, 2019, the last day of school, and my last day of school as a freshman. It also falls on an amazing tier of the best days of my life, as even though it wasn't that eventful, it was still a good one since I had the feeling of accomplishment throughout the day. One of the best feelings you could have. So to start, my grandmother took me directly to school that day. Unlike usual where she would drop me off, she parked her car as our school did awards day on the last day of school, and I invited her to attend. So she did. I helped her get to the multipurpose room where awards day was, and then I reported the first block. Soon afterwards, everyone was taken to the multipurpose room and awards began. It pretty much worked like your typical awards day, where the teachers basically talk about the accomplishments of the school and give out awards to things like perfect attendance and highest grades in each class. I didn't receive any awards, but I was fine with it. Besides, I would accomplish something no other early college student had ever done before or since in Part 8, so that in of itself was equivalent of receiving every award at every award ceremony. Now, for the most part, this was a very forgettable award ceremony. However, there was one thing that I do remember from it that still makes me and my grandmother chuckle to this day. So near the end of the ceremony, the 10th grade math teacher read the children's book, Big Plans. This is a book about a young boy who has aspiring plans of world dominance and about the endless possibilities that the world offers. It perfectly exasperates the core idea of expeditionary learning, to learn by doing and exploring. So it was very fitting for us to, as expeditionary learning school, to read this book. And that was the task of the 10th grade math teacher. So we began reading it until he reached a particular part. In this part, the main character is giving orders and to other characters. The line in particular that he says is, "Listen here, bird." However, I don't know what was going through the teacher's mind, as instead of saying, "Listen here, bird," he said, "Listen here, big shit," in front of the entire school, our parents, teachers, and the principal. Immediately, everyone started laughing, including both my grandmother and principal, both of whom looked like they were going to die from laughter. I too laughed with everyone else, as I thought it was funny for this man, who was also my small group leader at church and the least likely person to do so, to say shit. But at least once he finished, we all gave him an extra round of applause as our principal took back the stage, and then after some final words, he dismissed us. My grandmother then signed me out, and then we went home. And with that, my freshman year of high school had come to an end. This was a very important school year for me, given that it was my first year at early college and at a non-traditional school. It allowed me to set the foundation for the rest of my academic career, and it also allowed me to grow as a person and learn more about myself. Just like with 8th grade, I also grew a ton this school year, being almost completely unrecognizable from August 7th to May 21st. It would also be the last quote-unquote normal school year, since it was the last school year before the coronavirus pandemic. So overall, this is a very successful school year, as well as one of my favorite school years to look back on. As for my final grades, I'll go ahead and give them as a rundown for all the classes I took this school year. Starting with high school classes, I made an 88 in English, a 90 in Geometry, and a 91 in Algebra 2. I also passed seminar. For college courses during the fall 2018 semester, I made an 82 in Computers, a 96 in Academic Support, a 92 in Community Health, and a 100 in PE. For college courses during the spring 2019 semester, I made a 96 in Communications, a 100 in Health, a 96 in Business, and an 86 in Film. So yeah, that's the end of the story time, as well as part 5 of 8 of the extensive reflection project. I hope y'all did enjoy, and be on the lookout for part 6.